You think you know Adolf Hitler? You've never seen him like this before. Hitler's contemporaries, from his birth in Braunau to his death in the bunker, authentically flesh out the picture. Who was Hitler? Hitler neither finished school nor had any vocational training. He occasionally lived in homeless shelters or on the street. He refused to pursue a regular job. To this day, it seems inexplicable that he could come to power. Out of nowhere, Hitler became the Führer, leader of the German Reich, one of the most powerful men of the 20th century, starting an inferno that engulfed the world and brought death to millions of people. The nation worshipped him and followed him blindly into the abyss. But during his lifetime, he kept his origins and his life secret. No one should know how or who he was. Fascinating and oppressive accounts from companions, friends, and enemies, as well as the most extensive collection of archive material ever shown. Much of it, hitherto unpublished, reveal who Hitler was and how he could become what he was. A notorious liar and an unscrupulous murderer. Under the protection of the Hitler-Stalin pact, Hitler invades Poland. Great Britain and France immediately declare war on Germany. Despite all the warnings, this comes as a surprise for Hitler. He is unsure of himself, but the rapid occupation of Poland restores his self-confidence. The continuing passivity of the Western Allies encourages him to go further. After the occupations of Denmark and Norway, he invades the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. Great Britain is stunned. The British army is defeated and has to flee head over heels via Dunkirk. Hitler's confidence rises to immeasurable heights, but his next steps will have fatal consequences.
Führer spoke at length and in detail about the ongoing incorporation of the former provinces of Posen and West Prussia. The social strata thought to be racially valuable could be Germanized. In principle, they would have to look racially pure and have the right hereditary disposition. A special cultural heritage group would be created. Here, language would be the most important factor. He said he wasn't interested in the Polish intelligentsia, as they were the supporters of Polish nationalism. Gerhard Engel, army adjutant to Hitler, memoirs in diary form.
Heinrich Himmler's pocket diary. Berlin, office, post-briefing, 13 minutes. 11 a.m., leave for Plock. 1 p.m., land in Plock, drive to Mlawa. Dinner and overnight stay there. Rudolf Brandt, SS Colonel.
The Poles are not a people to form a state. I traveled back and forth across the country with the Reichsführer SS. A country with so little idea of the essence of settlement has no claim to independent power in the European sphere. It is a colonial country. Hans Jost, writer, president of the Reich Literature Chamber.
If a German passed by, a Pole had to step off the sidewalk. A Pole could not travel by automobile or trolley and was even forbidden to own a bicycle. He had been placed completely outside protection of the law. And all his property, movable or immovable, was at the disposal of the German authorities. Jan Karski, courier of the Polish underground.
Diary, Tuesday, April the 9th, 1940. Nasty weather. Housework and errands in the morning. Learn that the Germans have marched into Denmark and Norway. God knows what comes next. Otto Blumenthal, Jewish-German mathematician, in exile, Utzulen, near Utrecht.
After the war, we'll have to ask the English how they could claim on a daily basis to rule the waves when Germany was able to land troops in 6 different places in Norway. Friedrich Kellner, court employee, Laubach.
Diary, Wednesday, April the 10th, 1940. Contradictory news from Norway. Naval battle at Narvik. Otto Blumenthal.
After the surrender of Norway on June the 10th, 1940, the German Army, Navy and Air Force station up to 400,000 servicemen in this country with less than 3.5 million inhabitants. The Norwegians are forced to supply whatever the occupiers need. In a race against the British, Norway has been occupied for economic reasons and because the German Navy wants to control the Norwegian coastline to prevent a British blockade. From 1942 onwards, the German army divisions are not particularly strong. Above all, they are used to secure the supply of Swedish iron ore via the port of Narvik against an Allied invasion.
From all this wreckage and confusion, there emerged one fact of major importance potentially affecting the whole future of the war. In their desperate grapple with the British Navy, the Germans ruined their own, such as it was, for the impending climax. Winston Churchill, the Second World War.
Diary, April the 11th, 1940. Visited Saarbrücken, the Speichener Heights, the bullet-ridden villages of no man's land. Abandoned old French trenches with mattresses and blankets. Endless bunker construction. Houses in the village, piles of rubble. Hanging walls full of holes. If one day the whole West looked like this, it would be horrible. Alfred Rosenberg, Director of the Foreign Policy Office of the NSDAP.
I tried to read in the faces of the thousands what was in their minds this Easter day. But their faces looked blank. Obviously, they do not like the war, but they will do what they're told. Die, for instance. William Shira, reporter for Columbia Broadcasting System.
At lunchtime on May the 9th, we left Berlin in great secrecy and travelled at first light towards Hamburg, turned the train around and arrived in Aachen at 3 a.m. Under a beautiful starry sky, we went by car to the command post of the Führer's headquarters, the Felsennest or Rocky Eyrie. Wilhelm Keitel, Supreme High Commander of the Armed Forces, Memoirs.
Hitler gathered his small executive staff and announced in a firm, clear voice that the offensive against France had begun that morning. The first birds were chirping in the dewy bushes, and in the distance, we could hear the thunder of artillery. Christa Schröder, Hitler's private secretary.
On May the 10th, 1940, the opponent mounted a big offensive. 10 tank and 6 motorized divisions rolled towards the west in 2 groups. On the downward slope to which we had been mistakenly led, our army, the government, and the whole of France now plunged with dizzying speed to its ruin. And yet there were 3,000 modern French tanks and 800 machine guns mounted on trucks. The Germans didn't have more than that either. Charles de Gaulle, Tank Division Commander, Memoirs.
Diary, May the 10th, 1940. The final battle is beginning and will decide the fate of Germany, probably forever, definitely for centuries. The Dutch have now been agitating against us for 7 years and have let in all immigrants. They were just interested in doing business and were bosom friends to all the Jews in the world. Alfred Rosenberg.
In the first Armed Forces report at noon on May the 10th, I had recorded the sentence, "The Führer has personally taken over supreme command of the German army operating in the West." I wrestled with him for half an hour over the approval of this publication. He declared he wanted to remain anonymous and not diminish the glory for the generals. I did not let up, and in the end he gave in. Wilhelm Keitel.
Transcript of talks between Admiral Darlan and the Führer at Obersalzberg. The Führer emphasized that he didn't have the ambition to become a great commander, but more importantly, to protect the cultural and social rise of the German nation as the Führer of its people. Others had insisted he become commander.
He was the revolutionary spirit and the pulsating element of the German army and its great organizational machinery. He knew its tendency to exaggerated thoroughness, against which he tirelessly fought. Otto Dietrich, head of press of the NSDAP.
Hitler took the credit for the success of the Western campaign. Albert Speer.
The Western campaign of 1940 revealed another of Hitler's character traits. He was very bold in the creation of his plans. Norway was a courageous plan. The tank breakthrough equally so. But when the first difficulties arose, in contrast to his unshakable persistence in the face of political difficulties, he would vacillate in military questions because he instinctively sensed his lack of ability in this field. Heinz Guderian, Lieutenant General, Armored Corps.
Diary, Friday, May the 10th, 1940. Now the war has really begun. Chamberlain has stepped down and Churchill replaced him. One bad person has left and a much worse one has come. Henrietta Schneider, housekeeper, East Prussia.
Thus, then, on the night of the 10th of May, at the outset of this mighty battle, I acquired the chief power in the state. I cannot conceal that I was conscious of a profound sense of relief. I felt as if I were walking with destiny, and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial. Winston Churchill.
Diary, Saturday, May the 11th, 1940. If I had to spend my whole life with a man, I would choose Mr. Chamberlain. But I think if there was a storm and I was shipwrecked, I would sooner have Mr. Churchill. He has a funny face, like a bulldog in our street. Nella Last, Barrow in Furness, Lancashire.
Winston is a dictator. He cannot be overruled, and his colleagues fear him. The people have set him up as something little less than God, and his power is therefore terrific. Robert Menzies, Prime Minister of Australia, from 1939 to 1941.
Diary, Tuesday, May the 21st, 1940. Our armies are 130 kilometers from Paris. We've reached the Channel. Henrietta Schneider.
The English are an amazing nation, and I think it is true that nothing becomes them like catastrophe. When they are really up against it, their negative qualities turn positive in a glorious somersault. Slowness, understatement, complacency change into endurance and pride, the begetter of self-discipline. Martha Gellhorn, war correspondent of the US Army.
The well-trained English army appears to be finished for the most part. One would do well to have a small flask of morphine handy. One might need it. Stefan Zweig, Austrian writer, in exile, Bath, England.
May the 23rd, 1940. We've done it. The Air Force is destroying the English on the beach. I was able to persuade Hitler to stop the army. The Führer wants this to be a lesson for them. Hans Jeschenek, Chief of the General Staff of the Air Force to Erhard Milch, State Secretary of the Aviation Ministry.
Diary. Friday, May the 24th, 1940. The ring is tightening around the enemy armies in northern France. Henrietta Schneider.
May the 26th, 1940, Dunkirk. By order of the very highest level, the tank and motorized units are standing on the heights and are not allowed to attack. There is an understandable nervousness on the part of the commander-in-chief of the army, because waiting for orders from on high when the back of the enemy is open to attack is incomprehensible. Franz Halder, Chief of the General Staff of the Army.
Memoirs in diary form, May the 27th, 1940. The Field Marshal landed. Discussion with the Führer. Göring announced success in Dunkirk harbor, saying,
"Only trawlers are coming across. I hope the Tommies are good swimmers."
Gerhard Engel, Army Adjutant to Hitler.
The mass of the British Army got to the other side unharmed. They left their weapons behind and escaped. Erhard Milch, General of Aviators, to Hermann Göring.
Diary, June the 8th, 1940. I anticipate that Italy will come in now. It is a hard time for all who care for freedom. Neville Chamberlain, Lord President of the Council.
Fascist Italy does not participate in the war against Poland or Western and Northern Europe, but Mussolini wants to benefit from Hitler's victories and get a share of fame and booty. On June the 10th, 1940, Benito Mussolini declares war on France and Britain.
Italians. At that memorable meeting in Berlin, I said that if someone has a friend, he marches with him to the end, according to the laws of fascist morality. And that is what we have done with Germany, with its people, with its victorious armed forces.
Diary, Friday, June the 11th, 1940. And what is the secret of this victory? Surely the immense dynamism of the Führer. Eduard Wagner, Artillery General.
Diary, Friday, June the 14th, 1940. News at 1 o'clock at night. Paris occupied by our troops without a fight. Flag raised for 3 days. Henrietta Schneider.
Letter to William S. Schlam, Courier, Portugal, end of June 1940. It was confirmed everywhere that the surrender of Paris had been a demoralizing factor. From that day on, according to one officer, the Germans couldn't advance as fast as the French fled. Friedrich Thorberg, born 1908 as Friedrich Ephraim Cantor Berg, Austro-Czech writer.
Adam Cherniakov, head of the Jewish Council of the Warsaw Ghetto. Diary, June the 17th, 1940. Jews will be evicted from public housing. Rumors yesterday that all of France has collapsed.
France offered a ceasefire on June the 17th. I've never seen Hitler as happy as on that day. Heinz Linger, valet to Adolf Hitler.
France's peace offer was submitted to him while he stood surrounded by his officers. He slapped his thigh in a lively gesture. We were to one side and observed the scene that Walter Franz also filmed. Christa Schröder, he was my boss.
Heinrich Hoffmann. Keitel, who was carried away by an outburst of emotion, coined the fatal phrase,
My Führer, you are the greatest military commander of all time.
Part of Hitler's growing self-deification after the first military successes involved believing it himself. Franz Halder.
Charles de Gaulle radio broadcast on the BBC to France, June the 18th, 1940. Is defeat final? No, for France is not alone. She is not alone. She has a vast empire behind her. She can align with the British Empire that holds the sea and continue the fight. She can, like England, use without limit the immense industry of the United States. I say this is not a Franco-German war to be decided by a single battle. I, General de Gaulle, currently in London, invite officers and French soldiers who are located in British territory to put themselves in contact with me. Whatever happens, the flame of the French resistance must not be extinguished and will not be extinguished.
In the Western Campaign, 50,000 soldiers of the German army die. More than 1.2 million soldiers from France, Great Britain, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and Belgium are captured.
Memoirs in diary form, June the 20th, 1940. Führer insisted that Breker and other artists and town planners come to the Führer headquarters. Even if those concerned don't understand questions of warfare and politics, they are still essential for the development of German art. Gerhard Engel.
June the 23rd, 1940. Hitler sheds light on my reason for being here.
I intend to drive to Paris with you, Speer, and Giesler.
A motorcade is waiting for us. Hitler sits next to the chauffeur in the first open car. I'm behind him. Next to me, Speer and Giesler. Paris is deserted. Dead. Not a soul in sight. This morbid impression seems to depress Hitler as well. Speechless, cramped, he cowers in his seat until we stop at the steps of the opera. Arno Breker, sculptor and architect.
It was my life's dream to see Paris. I can't tell you how happy I am that it has been fulfilled today.
For a moment, I felt sorry for him. 3 hours in Paris, the last and only time, made him happy, as if he was at the height of his success. Albert Speer.
Letter to Elizabeth Wagner, June the 29th, 1940. Yesterday I was in Paris. The city is coming alive again, if only a little, but it's something. It really is a magical place. The Führer was in Paris incognito the day before yesterday at 5 a.m. with Speer. I think he'll tear down Berlin after his impressions of this city. Eduard Wagner.
Eva Braun, who never appears in public, films the arrival of Adolf Hitler and his entourage in Berlin from a window of the Reich Chancellery. A large crowd of hundreds of thousands have waited for the Führer for 6 hours to give him an overwhelming reception.
Hitler was at the height of his power. He was the master of Europe. Gustav Mannerheim, Field Marshal of Finland.
Resistance to Hitler lost considerable ground in May and June 1940. Hitler's prestige had risen further. Ernst von Weizsäcker, State Secretary of the Foreign Ministry.
The mood at home also changed. The initial anxiety was replaced by radiant self-confidence. When the victory fanfare rang out, even old opponents of Hitler could not hide their joy. I also began to believe in the good outcome of the war. Lutz Graf Schwerin von Krosigk, Finance Minister.
The Hitler mystique was beyond analyzing. There was magic about the man. The gods or luck must have been totalitarian, for they or it loved this man. He never lost. He was predestined to win, or so it seemed. Howard K. Smith, correspondent of CBS in Berlin, 1940 to 1941.
Valley M., schoolgirl, Frankfurt am Main. One evening a week, we were allowed to listen to the German Army Request Program. We always looked forward to this, and our favorite songs were Lili Marleen and the Lullaby from Annelie. But we also listened to Bomben auf England.
The Atlantic coast, from the North Cape to the Spanish border, was in the hands of the Germans. The British Army was defeated and had fled the mainland with no weapons. The airspace on the continent was under German control. An invasion of Great Britain seemed under preparation. Ernst von Weizsäcker.
There were frequent visits by leading dignitaries. The Japanese always brought the most wonderful gifts. I can remember once there was a really old sea chart on which one could see how to walk from the mainland to Great Britain without getting one's feet wet. Rohushmish, SS Bodyguard Regiment.
A stay of a few days in the English capital was all that was needed to recognize the difference between London and Paris. Here, no one was considering capitulation. Julius Deutsch, Austrian socialist of Jewish descent, in exile, memoirs.
It was only after France had been flattened out that Britain, thanks to her island advantage, developed out of the pangs of defeat and the menace of annihilation a national resolve equal to that of Germany. Winston Churchill.
Diary, Saturday, July the 20th, 1940. Hitler spoke in the Reichstag, made an offer of peace to England. Henrietta Schneider.
Diary, August the 20th, 1940. Winston gave a great speech in the House of Commons. He speaks excellently. He does not brag too much. Harold Nicholson, Member of Parliament, National Labour Party.
The gratitude of every home in our island, in our empire, and indeed throughout the world, except in the abodes of the guilty, goes out to the British airmen who, undaunted by odds, unwearied in their constant challenge and mortal danger, are turning the tide of the world war by their prowess and by their devotion. Never, in the field of human conflict, was so much owed by so many to so few. Winston Churchill.
On August the 24th, 1940, the first bombs fall on London. Despite the fact that German bomber forces are 10 times larger and Allied planes have to fly 6 times further, Winston Churchill orders the immediate bombing of Berlin. On the night of August the 25th, 81 English bombers start out, 29 of which reach their target. More night raids follow. The attacks do not fail to have an effect on Hitler. On September the 4th, he announces his intention to wipe out London. As Goering's Air Force concentrates its bombing raids on the capital, the English aerial defences have a chance to catch their breath.
We had our first big air raid of the war last night. The Berliners were stunned. They did not think it could happen. When this war began, Goering assured them that it couldn't. The Berliners are a naive and simple people. William Shirer, U.S. journalist.
Basic training for men born in 1923 at the Fighter Squadron of Air Regiment 2 in Klagenfurt in Carinthia. Carinthia is a Reichsgau in Austria, which is now called Ostmark in the Greater German Reich. More than 1.3 million of the Austrian male population of approximately 7 million are drafted into the Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS between 1939 and 1945. 242,000 Austrians are killed in action. That is about 8% of the male population, while in the Old Reich it is more than 30%. The governments of Canada, Australia, New Zealand and South Africa formally request that the royal family, or at least the 2 young princesses, be brought to safety in order to protect the crown, regardless of the fate of the motherland.
The children won't go without me, I won't leave without the king, and the king will never leave. Queen Elizabeth, Queen Consort of King George VI.
There is a time to live and a time to die. Winston Churchill.
Memoirs in diary form, November the 4th, 1940, Reich Chancellery. An unpleasant meeting at headquarters, attended by Goering, von Brauchitsch, Keitel. Due to English and other press reports, Führer for the first time doubts the successes of the Luftwaffe and the strike figures. Führer visibly depressed. Have the impression that he doesn't know how to proceed. Gerhard Engel.
The gent has taken off his clothes and put on his bathing suit, but the water is getting colder, and there is an autumn nip in the air. Winston Churchill.
The day after Italy's declaration of war, the 7th British Tank Division was transferred to the Libyan frontier. We were not exactly the most modern force on Earth, Some of our armored cars were old Rolls-Royce Silver Ghosts, used by Lawrence of Arabia in the First World War. But we quickly took one border post after another. Dennis Avey, Private, 2nd Rifle Battalion. November the 17th, 1940. We gathered close to the Libyan frontier, 40 miles south of the sea, in a forbidding but now familiar landscape of sand and gravel. At 0600 hours the next morning, November the 18th, we cut through the wire and set off. All around, we could see tanks and other vehicles streaming across the desert towards Tobruk. Dennis Avey.
On December the 10th, the Italians suffered a severe defeat in Africa at Sidi Barrani. Marshal Graziani begged for German air support. Mussolini considered asking the Germans to send 2 tank divisions to Libya. German troops under Rommel got the situation under control. Heinz Guderian.
But now a new figure sprang upon the world stage. Rommel took charge of the growing German contingent. He strove immediately to enforce an offensive campaign. His ardor and daring inflicted grievous disasters upon us. But he deserves the salute which I made him in the House of Commons in January 1942, when I said of him, "We have a very daring and skillful opponent against us, and, may I say, across the havoc of war, a great general." Winston Churchill.
The next day, November the 20th, we buried my friend, Bill Manley. Dear old Bill. It was towards first light when we buried him. I got on my knees, pulled as much sift sand away as I could, trying to prevent it trickling back into the shallow grave. We removed 1/2 of the dog tag from around his neck and dropped him into a shallow dent in the desert. I tried not to look at his face as I pushed the sand back over him. I left him somewhere in the shifting sands, south of Sidi Rezé. Dennis Avey.
Diary Berlin, December 1st, 1940. For most Germans, this is an end in itself. For to be strong in their scheme of life is to be all. It is the emergence of the primitive tribal instinct of the early German pagans of the vast forests of the north, to whom brute strength was not only the means, but the end of life. It is this primitive racial instinct of blood and soil which the Nazis have reawakened in the German soul. William Shirer.
Paris in November 1940. The defeat of France leads to a partition of the country under the Armistice of Compiègne, the German garrison headquarters on Place de l'Opéra. Under the German occupation, the Parisian cityscape changes. The German soldiers have their own cinemas, cafes, and about 60 brothels. The Guard regiment marches along the Champs-Élysées to the garrison headquarters. Northern France, Paris, and the entire Atlantic coast are subject to a German occupying regime. From July 1940, the south, over 40% of France, and the colonies are managed by a new French government based in Vichy, which pursues a course of limited collaboration with the Germans.
The Führer and the Supreme Commander of the German Army, the Führer headquarters, absolutely top secret, for officers only, 9 copies, second copy, order number 21, Operation Barbarossa. Even before the end of the war against England, the German army has to be prepared to overthrow Soviet Russia in a quick campaign, Operation Barbarossa. The bulk of the Russian army in Western Russia should be destroyed in bold operations via tank pincer movements in order to prevent the withdrawal of strong combat units into the expanses of the Russian interior.
Adolf Hitler.
Memoirs in diary form, December the 18th, 1940. The order for Barbarossa has been issued. The Army Supreme Commander has ordered us to find out whether the Führer wants armed engagement or is just bluffing. In my opinion, Führer himself still doesn't know how to proceed. He hopes the English will capitulate and doesn't believe the USA will enter the war. Gerhard Engel.
In September 1939, the Wehrmacht and the Red Army determined the line of the border in occupied eastern Poland on the basis of the Hitler-Stalin pact. Stalin's Soviet Union strictly adheres to the agreement and supplies raw materials to the German Reich. In the next 1.5 years, there will be no conflict along the now 2,000-kilometer-long border.
Diary, Wednesday, January the 1st, 1941. We heard the Führer's message to the German people on the radio, wonderful and full of confidence in victory. Willem Zig also came, and we ended up playing a cosy game of skat. Henrietta Schneider.
On February the 18th, 1941, we drove from Berchtesgaden to Hitler's house on Obersalzberg. Hitler greeted us in the entrance hall with the tree of Untersberg. Here, Hitler spoke. For 1.25 hours, he gave a summary of the development of the armored tank. He concluded his talk about tank characteristics by saying, what's most important? Armament second most important, and armor a distant third. His opinion, in a nutshell, was,
the tank is not an insurance policy.
Walter Roland, industrialist, commissioner for tank production in Ministry of Armaments and War Production.
At the beginning of April 1941, the motorized flak regiments 19 from Kitzingen and 6 from Hamburg were relocated from France and Belgium to Bulgaria. In the foothills of the Rila and Pirin mountains, watched by Bulgarian troops, a football match between the regiment's first batteries takes place. Tsar Boris III visits the troops. 6 weeks earlier, the Kingdom of Bulgaria joined the Axis Pact of Germany, Italy and Japan, and the Wehrmacht was allowed to station its forces in the Balkan state. Bulgaria will take part in the war against Yugoslavia and Greece, but never declares war on the Soviet Union in the Second World War.
Hitler regards the Serbs as the most effective at nation-building and thus the most dangerous people in the Balkans. Milovan Djilas, Yugoslavian communist from Montenegro. Memoirs.
Diary, April the 5th, 1941. Very early on Saturday morning, the attack on Yugoslavia and Greece is to begin. In Greece, we will try to reach Thessaloniki as quickly as possible. Yugoslavia will also be attacked by Bulgaria and Hungary. The state will be broken up. Italy will be given the coast, Bulgaria, Macedonia, and our Bavarian Eastern March areas are to receive the former Austrian provinces. Josef Goebbels.
Germany declares war on Yugoslavia. Similarities to statements made before the invasions of Poland, Norway, Belgium and Holland. The German troops have been ordered to restore order in the Balkans, said Hitler. The Serbs will offer resistance, but for how long? At the moment, The Wehrmacht is attacking Yugoslavia and Greece. Details are not known, but we should have further news by tonight. Michael Sebastian, Romanian Jewish journalist.
Weather as yesterday, a little cloudier at lunchtime and still cold. Thessaloniki occupied by the Germans. Otto Blumenthal.
Diary, Easter Monday, April the 14th, 1941. The position in Libya becomes worse, and Egypt is threatened. In the Balkans, the Yugoslavs are going to collapse, and as the Greeks have not withdrawn their Albanian divisions, our Greek position rendered untenable. Robert Menzies, Prime Minister of Australia.
Generalfeldmarschall Keitel überbringt die Glückwünsche des Führerhauptquartiers.
Diary, Monday, April the 21st, 1941. Yesterday, the Führer celebrated his birthday on the Balkan front. Henrietta Schneider.
Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring trifft ein. Der Reichsmarschall überbringt dem Führer die Glückwünsche der Wehrmacht.
Hitler's invasion allowed suppressed century-old darkness to rise again, in a new guise and with new motivation. No nation is free of similar phenomena. Neighbors had lived peacefully next to neighbors, and both would have continued their whole lives long, like their grandfathers. But now they're looting and wiping each other out. Milovangelas.
New Year's Eve 1942. A man in Dessau lights the last cigar of peace. Unlike in the First World War, thanks to the plundering of occupied territories, people in the Greater German Reich do not starve during the Second World War.
Diary, April the 24th, 1941. Some shortages in Berlin, above all tobacco and beer. I'll fix this. The people have to be kept happy. Joseph Goebbels, Gauleiter of Berlin.
Radio address on the BBC, April the 27th, 1941. The peoples of the British Empire and of the United States are determined that the cause of freedom shall not be trampled down. Last time I spoke to you, I quoted the lines of Longfellow. I have some other lines which are less well known, but which are appropriate to our fortunes tonight. And I believe they will be so judged wherever the English language spoken or the flag of freedom flies. For while the tired waves vainly breaking seem here no painful inch to gain, far back through creeks and inlets making comes silent, flooding in the main, and not by eastern windows only. When daylight comes in the light. In front the sun climbs slow, how slowly, but westward look, the land is bright. Winston Churchill.
Diary, May the 27th, 1941. Report. I have never believed and cannot see how the British Empire can defeat Germany without the help of God or Uncle Sam. Perhaps it will take both. General Raymond E. Lee, Chief of U.S. Military Intelligence in Great Britain.
My next-door neighbour says she prays to God to strike Hitler dead. Cannot help thinking, if God wanted to do that, he would not have waited till Mrs. Helm asked him to do so. Nella Last, Barrow in Furness, Lancashire, Diary.
Hitler breaks the pact with Stalin and invades Russia. His aim is to eradicate the entire Russian people and use the territory as a settlement region for the Aryan race. The German army quickly conquers large parts of Russia and besieges Moscow. Hitler has reached the pinnacle of German military power. Almost the entire European continent is under his control. His generals are concerned, but unconditionally obedient. After these rapid successes, the German army is faced with the unlimited manpower of the Red Army and, above all, with the incredible distances and harsh winter in Russia. After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and the subsequent US declaration of war on Japan, Hitler declares war on the USA. Will Hitler recognize that there is a growing imbalance of military power and act accordingly?
Up until 1942, he needed particular decorum and big rooms to think about important diplomatic activities or to plan offensives. Christa Schröder, Hitler's private secretary.
In the living hall of the Berghof, there was a large globe. An army adjutant pointed meaningfully to a pencil line running from north to south in the Urals. Hitler had drawn the line to identify the future boundary of the spheres of influence that were agreed with the Japanese. Albert Speer, Memoirs.
Letter to US President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Describing Hitler and Germany, Mr. Stalin spoke that the Germans were a people who, without a second's thought, would sign a treaty today, break it tomorrow, and sign a second one the following day. Harry Hopkins, Moscow.
Franz Halder, Major General, War Diary. Devastating verdict on Bolshevism. Is equal to antisocial criminality. Communism, tremendous danger for the future. We must distance ourselves from the attitude of soldierly camaraderie. The communist is no comrade beforehand and no comrade afterwards. It is a battle of extermination. Eradication of communist intelligence.
I had a belief in the foresight and wisdom of the German General Staff that was hard to shake. And I could not credit that these strategically and tactically trained minds would embark on a two-front war if they thought they were not sure that the Blitzkrieg technique would lead to victory. I thought it likely that it would lead to the end of Russia, as it had come to the end of France. I was wrong. Karl Zuckmayer, German-Austrian dramatist in British exile.
Diary, Monday, June the 9th, 1941. There's a big operation here. The streets are full of military of every kind on their way to the border. Henrietta Schneider, Elk, East Prussia.
When he decided on the Eastern Campaign in the summer of 1941, he told Eva Braun he had to travel to Berlin for a few days. Christa Schröder.
When Adolf heard the music of Wagner, he was transformed. Then he lost his fierceness. He became quiet, flexible, manageable. The unease disappeared from his face. What had moved him during the day vanished. August Kubitschek, childhood friend.
Wagner's music became second nature to him. Ernst Hanfstaengl, until 1937, head of the NSDAP Foreign Press Bureau.
He loved the Wagner opera the most. Other than that, symphonies by Beethoven and Bruckner, or songs by Richard Strauss. Of the light entertainment pieces, he appreciated The Bat and The Merry Widow. Bormann proved his musical knowledge just by changing the records. Heinrich Hoffmann, photographer.
It was almost always the same repertoire that Hitler had them play. The only popular song Hitler allowed was the Donkey Serenade, which often concluded the concert. Gertraud Traudl-Junge, Hitler's private secretary.
You'll be hearing that a lot in the near future. It'll be the victory fanfare for our Russian campaign. How do you like it? Adolf Hitler to Albert Speer after listening to the first bars of Les Préludes by Franz Liszt. The Russian fanfare, June the 21st, 1941.
Diary, Saturday, June the 21st, 1941. Wild rumors are coming from the border. Henrietta Schneider.
On the evening of June the 21st, the chief of staff of the Kiev military district called and said that a German sergeant had defected to the border guards. He claimed the German troops were moving into their staging areas for an attack that would begin early on June the 22nd. I notified Stalin immediately. Georgy Zhukov, Chief of Staff of the Red Army.
It's always a strange feeling before battle. The mood is like at a party. Horst Rochow, Kassel, regimental doctor in the 24th Tank Regiment of the 24th Tank Division.
War Diary of the Army Group North, June the 22nd, 1941. Beginning of the invasion, 3:05 a.m. The entire front of the Army Group crossed the border. Robert Freiherr von Griesenbeck, Major.
It was June the 22nd, 1941. The night was wonderfully warm and full of the scent of flowers. The nightingales sang like never before. Then it struck 1, 2, 3 o'clock. And it remained deadly quiet. In the next few seconds, artillery fire erupted and the earth threatened to explode. Anita von Goldammer, Mochishkiai, Memel District.
Around 4:10 a.m., the West and Baltic military districts announced the beginning of the German offensive in their territory. Around 4:30 a.m., all members of the Politburo had assembled. Stalin looked pale at the table, pipe in hand. I suggested that all military districts on the border immediately employ all means against the enemy troops that had broken through and stop their continued advance. Not stop them, destroy them, Timoshenko stated more precisely. Give the order, Stalin said. Georgy Zhukov.
Is he mad, this Hitler? He could have allied himself with England's Chamberlain against communist Russia, or with communist Russia against the Anglo-Saxon capitalist world. But he invaded both. Yes, he is mad. Thank God. Klaus Mann, son of Katja and Thomas Mann. A life's report. Hitler sends us to Russia to conquer subhumans. But now I see Russia the way it is. The endless expanses, gently rising hills, occasionally a village with always the same one-story farmhouses. Then the only building made of stone, a church with a classical tower to one side. The land of farmers, the land of monks. Otto Eicher, soldier.
With endless grain and wheat fields and giant sunflower forests as a backdrop, I now experience the war in the precision of its metallic order, in the steel lights of its machinery, in the unceasing uniform roar of 1,000 engines. Curzio Malaparte, author and war correspondent of the Italian newspaper Corriere della Sera, The Volga Rises in Europe.
With the exception of Falsenest in the Eifel region, Hitler's headquarters all had names that appeared with the word Wolf, Wolf, Schanzer, Wer Wolf, Wolf schluckt. Heinrich Hoffmann.
Christa Schröder. It all began so promisingly. In the first 2 days in the Wolfschanze, we experienced the boss standing in front of a large map of Europe and pointing to Moscow, saying,
"In a few weeks we'll be in Moscow, there's no doubt about that. And then I'll raise Moscow to the ground. I'll build a reservoir there. The name Moscow has to be erased completely." Adolf Hitler, quoted by his secretary Christa Schröder.
Type of warfare completely different than the German plan. Right from the beginning, with the absence of solid fronts and secured flanks. At first unpleasant for the army, today it has solid flanks. War, but without structure. Führer says you have to read Karl May to get inside him. No more information about our own and Russian strengths. Everything uncertain. Security of the Führer by no means absolute. Admits he's been terrified at times, but always strong when the going gets tough. Walter Scherf, Captain, Führer's Commissioner for Military Historiography.
The Request concert, broadcast every Sunday afternoon on the radio, was popular with young and old. When Wilhelm Strins, with his wonderful voice, sang Homeland Your Stars, you could have heard a pin drop. Eleonora V., born 1924, restaurant owner.
Wilhelm Keitel, Chief of the Armed Forces High Command, to Field Marshal Fedor von Bock on July the 25th, 1941. The speedy collapse of Russia is vital for German interests, since Russia cannot be subjugated. The Führer was concerned about this situation and asked, worriedly,
"How much time do I have left to finish off Russia? And how much time do I still need?"
August the 28th, 1941. Meeting of Mussolini and Hitler at the front near Uman, south of Kiev.
Russia, Army Group South, letter 1941. It is our war, not as the enemy propaganda likes to call it, Hitler's war. They don't know that Hitler's one of us, a soldier like us. We know that he would do everything in his power for us. That gives us unlimited trust. The Führer leaves no comrade in the lurch, and when he doesn't help, it's because there was something more important. Horst Rochow, regimental doctor from Kassel.
When Mussolini visited the Russian front, he was really impressed by the contact between the German officers and their soldiers. Hitler and he ate together with simple soldiers, and they had the same food. Rachele Mussolini, Memoirs.
Recording of the leave-taking from Hitler of the Italian ambassador Bernardo Attolico and his wife. The Führer replied that he had always advocated German-Italian friendship. Besides, there was also a personal element to this. In Mussolini, he treasured a great contemporary to whom he was bound through a deep personal affection. Should anything happen to Mussolini, then the Führer would feel really isolated. Pichenko, September 1941. Ever onwards, deep into the Russian continent, to the Bug, the Dnieper, the Donetsk, the Don, the Volga, to the Caspian Sea. And then winter will come, the lovely winter, and then dust and rain again, dust and mud, until the winter comes again, the lovely winter of Holy Russia. Curzio Malaparte, the Volga rises in Europe.
Diary, September the 9th, 1941. In the evening Führer's table. Führer, we Germans like only Finland, possibly Sweden, and of course England. A German-English alliance would be an alliance from people to people. The English just have to keep their hands off the continent. Their empire in the world they can keep. Walter Havel, Ambassador and SS Oberführer, representative of the Foreign Office with the Führer.
I say this here today because I can say it today. This enemy is already crushed and will never rise again. Adolf Hitler, speech on the occasion of the opening of the War Winter Relief Drive on October the 3rd, 1941.
At the front, which was then near Smolensk, I made the acquaintance of what the Russians call General Mud. We travelled to the front through deep, tenacious mud, which reminded me of maple syrup turned to glue. We drove through battlefields that looked like the end of the world. Margaret Burke White, documentary photographer of Life magazine.
Diary, October the 10th, 1941, 11:30 p.m. It's snowing in Russia now, something we can't deal with well. Eduard Wagner, Artillery General.
There is a winter, you know, in Russia. For a good many months, the temperature is apt to fall very low. There is snow, there is frost, and all that. Hitler forgot about this Russian winter. He must have been very loosely educated. We all heard about it at school, but he forgot it. Winston Churchill.
Near the undamaged village, a dozen white crosses of acacia wood stand at the roadside. I stop to decipher the names of the fallen soldiers. All young men between 20 and 25. Curzio Malaparte, Shantabani in Bessarabia.
Diary, Sunday, November the 23rd, 1941. Partly cloudy, still mild. Morning, church, commemoration of the dead. Text, I am the resurrection and the life. More heavy fighting in Libya. Otto Blumenthal, Jewish-German mathematician, Utrecht.
Diary, November the 29th, 1941. A dark day today. Frau Wedig brought the sad news that Helmut Wilmensig was killed in action on November the 3rd, near Petersburg. Dr. Müller wrote me that his eldest son had fallen in the east on October the 28th. Henrietta Schneider.
Lunch with de Gaulle at Connaught Hotel. De Gaulle says he doesn't think the Germans will take Moscow. Harold Nicholson, Diary. Journal, December the 7th, 1941. I lunched with the president today in the Oval Office. We were talking about things far removed from war when Secretary Knox called to say they had picked up a radio message from Honolulu, from the commander-in-chief of our forces there, advising all our stations that an air raid attack was in progress and that it was no drill. I said I thought that surely Japan would not attack in Honolulu. At 2:28, Admiral Stark called the president and confirmed the attack. Churchill rang from England. The president told him that we were now all in the same boat. Harry Hopkins, advisor to President Roosevelt. Roosevelt has ordered the mobilization of American forces. The news makes me feel numb. Harold Nicholson, diary.
We cannot lose the war. We now have an ally that has not been defeated in 3,000 years.
Adolf Hitler to Walter Hevel on December the 8th, 1941.
Diary, Thursday, December the 11th, 1941. Around 3 o'clock, we listened to the Führer from the Reichstag. The war with America is also official now. The Führer will make sure everything turns out well. Henrietta Schneider.
Diary, Ulrich von Hassel, diplomat and member of the German resistance. It's no time for jokes anymore, but stories from the comic character Graf Bobby describe the situation. Graf Bobby looks at the globe and is told the big green region is Russia. The red parts are the British Empire. The light purple is the USA. And the yellow is China, all huge areas. And the little blue one? That's Germany. Does the Führer know how small it is?
When Pearl Harbor converted the issue into a struggle for survival, the United States produced the fighting machine that played an indispensable role in beating Germany to its knees. Dwight D. Eisenhower, Assistant Chief of Staff, U.S. Army.
I experienced how a democracy created a war machine in a few months. Overnight, factory directors and bank managers, civilian technicians, engineers and tradesmen turned into captains and majors, colonels and generals. Julius Deutsch, Austrian Social Democrat in U.S. exile. Memoirs.
December the 12th. I want to join the American Army. Klaus Mann.
When the German army, surprised by the terrible winter of 1941-42, got stuck in the Russian ice and snow, Hitler was frequently depressed. But as before, he hoped for a quick victory.
There is only a very thin veil that we have to penetrate. We have to be patient. The Russian resistance will not hold.
Christa Schröder.
On December the 17th, I visited the generals commanding the 14th and 47th Tank Corps, as well as the 7th Army Corps, to again learn about the condition of the troops. The three generals reported that the troops were beginning to have doubts about the high command. Black ice making all movement difficult. The Russians are prepared and equipped for winter, and we have nothing. Heinz Guderian, Colonel General.
Franz Halder, War Diary, December the 17th, 1941. Midnight, summoned to the Führer.
Disengagement is out of the question. The enemy has only made deep incursions in a few places. Setting up a rear echelon is illusory. The front is suffering in only one respect. The enemy has more soldiers. He has no more artillery. He is much worse off than we are.
Adolf Hitler, oral order to Army Group Center, December the 16th, 1941. Commanders, unit leaders and officers are to take personal steps to force troops to engage in fanatical resistance to hold their position, without regard to enemy breakthroughs on the flank or in the rear. Only with this kind of warfare can we gain the time necessary to get reinforcements from the homeland and the West that I have ordered.
The categorical order not to retreat, combined with Hitler's enormous prestige, but also the terror of his ruling apparatus, have a decisive impact on military performance, with fewer troops and weapons, in stabilizing the German front line and holding the combat effectiveness of the Wehrmacht intact.
Napoleon said in 1812, "The cold has been my ruin." Hitler's determination mastered the situation. His steadfastness warded off doom. Otto Dietrich, head of press of the NSDAP.
Diary, Monday, December the 22nd, 1941. The Führer announces that he has taken over command of the entire army. What are the grounds for this? Dear Müller thanked me for my sympathy about the loss of his son in action. Henrietta Schneider.
The Russians have smashed Hitler's greatest army in the world. Hitler dismisses his generals and takes command himself. Bertolt Brecht, German writer in exile.
Diary, December the 31st, 1941. Bad news from the front. In the evening saw the Führer. Subdued atmosphere. Führer said, "I'm glad to be able to solve large problems." May 1942 bring me as much luck as 1941 has. The worries can stay. Difficult times have always served as preparation for significant events. Listen to Bruckner's Seventh Symphony. Walter Havel.
Diary, January the 11th, 1942. How meek our military communiques have become. Friedrich Kellner, Laubach.
Adolf Hitler. Order for retreat to the East Army, January the 15th, 1942. This is the first time in this war that I will give the order to retreat along a large front position. I expect this retreat to take place in a form worthy of the German army. The troops' feeling of superiority over the enemy and the fanatical will to inflict the maximum damage must also dominate the retreat.
January the 18th and 19th, 1942, near Uranach on the River Tim. Our permanently cold feet hurt. Every step is torture, but we have to walk and move our limbs. Every incidence of frostbite could be interpreted as self-mutilation. Willi Peter Rehse, private.
Karl Töth, stenographer in the Führer headquarters, diary, review of military situation. While we were alone with the Führer, he addressed us. It was very cold in the room, and in his concern for us, he said we must be freezing, and he would therefore have a heater put under our seats. He said he couldn't tolerate the warmth himself, and got a headache when he leant over the maps on the table.
On the 11th of February 1942, Marshal Ion Antonescu visits the Wolfschanze headquarters. The Romanian leader takes part in the daily status report. Insiders refer to these meetings as a show.
During the journey to Hitler's headquarters,
I have written the protocols of my discussion in Görlitz Forest and recorded my general impressions. The atmosphere is depressing. Perhaps the atmosphere of the damp forest and the discomfort of communal living in the barracks are contributing to the bad news. The anterooms are full of people smoking, eating and talking away. The smell of the kitchen, uniforms, heavy boots. Everything is for the most part superfluous, at least for a great number of people who don't need to be here. Galeazzo Ciano, Foreign Minister of the Kingdom of Italy, Diary.
But the burden of work and increasing concerns from setbacks in the course of the war eroded Hitler's health. From the winter of 1941-1942 onwards, Morel monitored him day and night. In the end, Hitler began having mysterious injections almost every day. Christa Schröder, Hitler's private secretary.
Diary, Berlin, March the 3rd, 1942. The hallmarks of the situation. Further erosion of the German forces in Russia. Slow, further deterioration of the economic and food situations in Germany. Ulrich von Hassel.
Dwight D. Eisenhower, Chief of the War Plans Division of the U.S. General Staff. In the late winter of 1941-42, the U-boat campaign in the Atlantic was at almost the height of its effectiveness. We were monthly losing ships, including valuable tankers, by the score. A typical month was March 1942, when we lost in the Atlantic and Arctic areas 88 Allied and neutral ships. Simultaneously, we needed every type of fighting vessel, cargo, and personnel ship.
Particularly when it comes to the ordinary German woman, the housewife with whom one speaks on the street and in the shops, one gets the feeling that, despite all prohibitions, she continues to keep her own life pretty well intact. Karen Blixen, reporting for the Politiken newspaper, Copenhagen.
In 1941, more than 600,000 soldiers from Italy, Croatia, Slovakia, Romania and Hungary march eastwards with the Wehrmacht. Romania plans to recapture Bessarabia from the Soviet Union, and Hungary wants Hitler's support in the territorial conflicts with its neighbours. Slovakia and Croatia are vassal states of the German Reich.
May the 20th, 1942. We met many of our allies, some of whom made a very good impression. Spaniards, Slovaks, Hungarians. Horst Rochow, letter to his wife.
As the Wehrmacht can no longer offset its losses by recruiting in the Greater German Reich, Hitler urges his allies to provide larger troop contingents. In 1942, troop levels from the Allied states double in the east. The 4th of June 1942. Hitler flies to Finland to congratulate a man he thinks highly of on his birthday.
The Führer speaks out in great praise of Mannerheim. He is a terrific soldier. A shame that this brave nation is so small. Gerhard Engel, Army Adjutant to Hitler.
Field Marshal Kurt Mannerheim, who turns 75 years old today, is known as the strong man of Finland, which, as a brother-in-arms, has also been fighting the Soviet Union for 11 months and is supported by German divisions in the country. A recording exists of the talks between Hitler and Mannerheim, taped inadvertently by a Finnish radio technician. Witnesses remember Hitler's voice in a private setting as pleasantly warm. His deep baritone in guttural low Bavarian, the environment of his childhood, is totally different to the screaming shout of the orator Hitler, formed at a time without sound amplification.
Hätte ich im Jahre 39 Frankreich erledigt, dann wäre die Weltgeschichte anders gelaufen. Der 10. Mai war der erste schöne Tag Am 10. Mai habe ich sofort angegriffen. Ich konnte im September oder Oktober mit unseren Waffen keinen Krieg mehr beginnen, das war ja unmöglich. Wir hatten auch den Aufmarsch im Osten in keiner Weise vorbereitet. Die Verbände mussten ja auch im Westen erst wieder konsolidiert werden, es musste erst die Bewaffnung in Ordnung gebracht werden.
Mannerheim's Finland will sign a separate ceasefire with the Soviet Union in September 1944.
Diary, Friday, July 4th, 1942. Few clouds, temperature normal, slightly overcast at night. The Russian front breached along a 300-kilometer line. Otto Blumenthal, Utrecht.
After the victory over the Red Army at Kharkov on June the 28th, 1942, Hitler orders a major summer offensive. Due to the weakening of the Wehrmacht in the winter of 1941-42, the attack is limited to an 800-kilometer section in the area of the Army Group South. Hitler wants to conquer the Caucasian oil fields, reach the Caspian Sea, and push across the Caucasus to Persia. An encirclement of large formations of the Red Army, as during the attacks of 1941, fails. The Soviet troops withdraw strategically behind the Don-Volga line. Due to this rapid advance, Hitler gets the impression that the Red Army has lost decisive power. The conquest of the Crimea and advance to the Caucasus mark the greatest extent of Hitler's territorial dominion.
From Rostov-on-Don, several waves of retreats rolled through our area in the summer of 1942. The oil tanks were opened, wheat fields torched, all so that they wouldn't fall into the hands of the enemy. On August 3rd, 1942, German scouts surfaced on motorbikes. Within 3 days, German troops moved into Privolnoye. Soviet troops were scattered. But beyond Nalchik, barrier units worked to carry out Order N227 from Stalin. Not one step back. Mikhail Gorbachev, schoolboy.
July the 12th, 1942. It is becoming increasingly clear that military action will soon take place on the approach to Stalingrad. Alexei Chuyanov, first secretary of the party's Stalingrad Regional Committee.
War Diary, July the 30th, 1942, day 404. In the bow of the River Don, west of Stalingrad, the 6th Army of Army Group B is engaged in a fierce battle, and the situation is at present unclear. Franz Halder, Chief of the General Staff.
I wanted to come to the Volga, to a specific place and a specific city. Adolf Hitler, November the 8th, 1942.
Damn Hitler, who began this war. Damn all the generals, colonels, and military industrialists. Everyone who's to blame for this war and who wants it. A curse on this era. Willi Peter Reza, Corporal.
From Voronezh in the east to the Volga, the Soviet retreat had assumed the character of a disorderly flight. But an army of workers was waiting by the Volga. Curzio Malaparte, The Volga Rises in Europe, 1948.
Mother says, Father fell on August the 22nd. He volunteered to go to the front. He was sent to Verkhnyi Gniloy, northwest of Stalingrad. He was regimental commander when a shell fragment struck him in the head. He's dead. Ina next to me seems to shrink, as if becoming even smaller and thinner. Peter sobs. Mother doesn't cry. She says this seriously and soberly. Weber von Wedermeyer, born 1932.
On September the 11th, I was ordered to report to the frontline staff under Khrushchev. They told me to take over the 62nd Army. My orders were defend Stalingrad. After I accepted the order, Nikita Khrushchev asked me, "How do you see this?" I said, "I understand the order very well. I'll try to carry it out. Either I defend Stalingrad or I die doing so." I got in the car and drove to Stalingrad. Vasily Chuikov, Lieutenant General, the Stalingrad Protocols.
The high point of the war had been reached. Something unimaginable overpowered the wildest dreams. The North Cape, Pyrenees, Sahara and Volga formed the boundaries of a sphere of influence created overnight. For sure, there were bigger empires, but this one included Europe and its nations. There was no reason for joy. You knew what lay ahead for us because the disproportion of forces was obvious. Udo from Alvensleben, Army Captain, Diary.
Memories in diary form, October the 18th, 1942. Führer is in high spirits as the Red October tractor plant in Volgograd has been seized. Believes in early capture of all Stalingrad. Gerhard Engel, Army Adjutant to Hitler.
We knew that Hitler wouldn't stop and would keep throwing military forces at the front. But he sensed that it was not a battle for life being fought here, but rather a battle to the death. Vasily Chuikov, the Stalingrad Protocol.
I feel entitled to demand that every German soldier should sacrifice his life. Adolf Hitler to Heinz Guderian on December the 20th, 1940.
I have lost more than 4,000 men here. There were people dying, but my men didn't budge. Alexander Rodimtsev, Commander, 13th Guards Rifle Division of the 62nd Army Group.
On October the 26th, 1942, Max is killed. He is a 20-year-old battalion adjutant. It looks as if this is too much for Mother to deal with. She is getting bitter. That's noticeable, even if she doesn't want to show it. We young ones say, now Father is not alone anymore. Weber von Wedermeyer.
Diary. Sunday, November the 8th, 1942. The Führer spoke from the Munich Hofbräukeller. He laid into the war criminals again. The Americans landed in Algiers during the night. Monday, November the 9th, 1942. Landing of the Americans in Morocco. Henrietta Schneider.
Dr. Theo Morel, Adolf Hitler's personal physician, Diary, December the 15th, 1942. Patient A, sleeping badly because of the military situation. Profundal.
Through countless channels, the news trickles through about the catastrophic winter in the East. Visitors from every corner of Germany, new arrivals from the prisons, convicted soldiers, government officials on leave, all know and tell of the terror of the Russian Winter War. Rudi Goguel, communist, prisoner in Hamlin jail.
Up until the very end, the soldiers believed Hitler's promise that he would get them out of the encirclement. I knew that this was a terrible lie. Bernd Freitag von Loinghofen, Major.
Diary, Saturday, January the 23rd, 1943. No good news from the fronts. Tripoli abandoned. Henrietta Schneider.
From the west, the Americans marched to the outskirts of Tunis and dug in across from the German positions. It was clear that North Africa could not be held for much longer. Nikolaus von Below, Air Force Adjutant to Adolf Hitler.
Interrogation protocol of prisoner Hermann Strothmann, Lieutenant, Adjutant of the 1st Battalion of the 79th Panzer Grenadier Regiment, born 1918 in Münster, Catholic. Men reached the limits of their endurance, and this limit was reached on February the 2nd. We surrendered spontaneously. Around 6 o'clock in the morning, I was told that Russian tanks had arrived. I began to cry, walked out of the shelter, and laid down my weapon.
Diary, February the 4th, 1943. We are now forced to communicate the loss of Stalingrad to the German people. We release the news with correspondingly heroic pomp. I coordinate all the details with the Führer personally, who agrees with my suggestions. Joseph Goebbels.
This news triggered excitement in me that exceeded everything that I'd gone through until then. For me, it was quite clear. The war is decided, the Allies will win. World history will retain its sense. Marie Jalowicz Simon, a German Jew hiding in Berlin.
Erich von Manstein, General of the Army. Discussion on February the 6th, 1943. Hitler opened our meeting with the implicit recognition of his sole responsibility for the tragedy of the Sixth Army. I had the impression at the time that this tragedy caused more pain because it not only represented a blatant failure in his leadership, but that the fate of these soldiers really depressed him in a purely human way. Later, of course, doubts prevailed in me as to whether Hitler had ever had a heart for the soldiers.
At what point is one allowed to view the war as lost? As I see it, very late. Albert Speer, the Kranzberg Protocols.
Heinz Linger, valet to Adolf Hitler. Among Hitler's habits, which despite our efforts couldn't be remedied, was that he kept asking what time it was, above all, during the war.
Well, I principally only ever stop at 12:05. Adolf Hitler, in November 1942.
The defeats increase. Hitler's military decisions, often taken against all the advice of his generals, are increasingly catastrophic. The fronts fall apart. After Stalingrad, most of the military leadership is aware that the war is lost, but dare not say so openly. The Western Allies defeat the Italian and German troops under Rommel in North Africa and land in Italy. In the east, the Russians drive back the German army. Finally, the Allies land in Normandy, but Hitler will not accept defeat and refuses any idea of surrender. After a failed assassination attempt, he feels invulnerable and orders one absolute measure after another, dragging Germany, if not the world, into the abyss.
The muffled drum beats of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, the interval signal of the BBC listened to by half Berlin,
Here is England.
accompanied the gradual looming defeat.
Here is England.
Alda Schäfer, writer, memoirs.
For all capable minds, the Stalingrad catastrophe marked the beginning of the end. Bernd Freitag von Loringhoven, captain.
The heavy defeats of Stalingrad and Tunis that stand as everlasting milestones to the beginning of this era are, insofar as their reasons, their sequence and end are concerned, to be blamed above all on the man at the top of Germany's leadership, Hitler himself. Walter Wallemont, Deputy Chief, Supreme Command of the Wehrmacht.
Dubovka, February the 5th, 1943. Interrogation of prisoner of war Ernst Eichhorn, Regensburg. Captain of the 9th Company, 24th Tank Regiment, 24th Tank Division. A second front in Europe is impossible. The best German troops stand ready in northern France. Besides, the coastline is heavily fortified. Germany has enough reserves of men and materials. It will be able to fight for as long as necessary.
Up until 1940, Hitler looked younger than he was in reality. After that, however, he aged rather quickly. Up to 1943, he looked his age outwardly. Later, his rapid physical deterioration was obvious. Professor Dr. Hans Karl von Hasselbach, Deputy Attendant Doctor to Adolf Hitler.
I know that many people perceived Hitler as changed after Stalingrad. I wasn't one of them. Rohushmish, SS Bodyguard Regiment.
I was also overcome by concern and doubt after Stalingrad. But every time I spoke to Adolf Hitler, the worry and doubt fell away, thanks to the extraordinary fascination and radiance of his personality. Hermann Giesler, Hitler's architect.
Diary, February the 19th, 1943. To justify total warfare, Reichsminister Dr. Goebbels was let loose on the public at the Berlin Sportpalast on February the 18th, 1943. Friedrich Kellner, court employee, Laubach, Hesse.
At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the long-awaited rally at the Sportpalast takes place. The number of visitors is overwhelming. At 4:30, access to the Sportpalast has to be blocked due to overcrowding. Joseph Goebbels, diary.
It was one of those party-organized rallies with patriotic intellectuals and actors among the tame audience, whose positive reactions were meant to impress the common folk via the film cameras of the weekly newsreels. Albert Speer, Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production.
Gegnende behaupten, das deutsche Volk wehrt sich gegen die totalen Kriegsmaßnahmen der Regierung. Es will nicht den totalen Krieg, sagen die Engländer, sondern die Kapitulation. Wollt ihr den totalen Krieg? Wollt ihr ihn, wenn nötig, totaler und radikaler, als wir ihn uns überhaupt erst vorstellen können? Bereit, mit dem Führer als Phalanx der Heimat hinter der kämpfenden Wehrmacht stehen, diesen Kampf mit wilder Entschlossenheit und unbeirrt durch alle Schicksalsfügungen fortzusetzen, bis der Sieg in unseren Händen ist.
Diary, February the 21st, 1943. To my pleasure, I learned that circles close to the Führer listened to my speech in the Sportpalast and expressed enthusiasm. The Führer himself was so overloaded with work that he didn't manage it. Joseph Goebbels.
Stew Sunday in Korbach in northern Hesse. Since 1933, the NSDAP has propagated a regular, simple meal in families every other Sunday from October to March. The housekeeping money saved is collected by the party as a donate to the Winter Relief Organization. The collective sacrifice is also designed to save food reserves. Above all, for nearly 80 million people in the Greater German Reich, Stew Sunday is a forced commitment to the national community. After the proclamation of total war in 1943, the NSDAP registers the highest level of membership, 7.7 million.
Total war transformed me too into a soldier. I now wore the ice blue officer's uniform. There were 40 pilots, among them 5 women. Beate Uhse, pilot. Letter to parents in Cologne, Gärtlauken, district of Labiau, East Prussia, March the 25th, 1943. I was recently with the Mauritz family one evening. He has a building company and is a calm, quiet person. 2 months ago, his only son fell in battle. 19 years old, a hard-working, friendly boy. He was drafted in April 1942. I knew him. Now there are only 2 daughters left, 17 and 6 years old. The fatherland is entitled to every victim, the mother said quietly. But she and her husband were weeping. Marianne Günther, student teacher.
Address to the U.S. Congress, Washington, May the 19th, 1943. I am free to admit that in North Africa, we built better than we knew. The unexpected came to the aid of the design. For this, we have to thank the military intuition of Corporal Hitler. The same insensate obstinacy which condemned his army to destruction at Stalingrad has brought this new catastrophe upon our enemies in Tunisia. Winston Churchill.
The death of a human being didn't bother him at all. He saw people as the links in a long chain, and he considered the first link to be himself. Children were in his eyes only the potential by which the greater or smaller living space of a people was measured. Christa Schröder, Hitler's private secretary.
The soldiers that I met were not followers of Hitler and only served the Führer unwillingly. But all approved of war as an indispensable phenomenon of life. The war is the ultimate exertion that you cannot dodge. This picture was deeply ingrained in them. Wilma Sturm, journalist and writer.
The war as a dangerous child's game. These young men, trying to overcome their boredom with alcohol, are just 17 years old. Their military title is Luftwaffenhelfer, or Air Force Helpers. From 1943 onwards, they replace regular soldiers sent to the front on the anti-aircraft guns in the homelands. At the end of 1943, there are 80,000 young flak helpers. As a rule, they are deployed near their hometown. High school students have 18 hours of school lessons a week at their posts.
Diary, Monday, July the 26th, 1943. Mussolini has resigned. He's said to be ill. Last night, Hamburg, Essen and Kiel were bombed again. Henrietta Schneider, housekeeper, East Prussia.
While I endeavored to establish worthwhile targets to Hitler and the General Staff of the Air Force, our enemies launched 5 big attacks on only one major city, Hamburg. Although this action contradicted all tactical considerations, it had catastrophic consequences. Albert Speer.
The issue that divided the American and the British bombing commands centered on the prickly question of daylight bombing as opposed to nighttime raids. The Army Air Forces were convinced not only that higher-level, skillfully executed daylight raids could work, but that night bombing with its notorious imprecision would prevent a catastrophic waste of material and energy. Robert Morgan, Colonel, 8th U.S. Air Force, pilot of the bomber Memphis Belle.
We had known the main answer to the German defenses for a long time. Strips of metallized paper were dropped for the first time on the night of July 24th, 25th, and the target was Hamburg. Like other coastal targets, Hamburg was particularly easy to identify by H2S radar, as the outline of water gave us a clear response on the H2S screen. Some 700 aircraft attacked, and the weather was in every way favorable. Arthur Harris, Marshal of the Royal Air Force, Bomber Command.
Diary of fighter pilot Hans Ahrens, born 1921, killed in action February the 21st, 1944. That first night of terror on July the 25th will remain unforgettable for us and the majority of all Hamburg residents. Personally, I'm glad that I experienced it all. As a soldier, it led to an ultimate, resolute hatred of our enemy.
Letter to Georg Zimmermann, soldier in Norway, from his mother, Hamburg, July the 28th, 1943. Dear Georg, we are still alive, but Hamburg de facto no longer exists. No house left standing, just mountains of rubble, entire streets blocked. Dead bodies not salvaged, impenetrable smoke and fumes and fires still burning everywhere. Disintegration is in progress. No police anymore, nothing. Hamburg is lost forever. Magdalena Zimmermann.
When I travelled to the Badine from Babelsberg, I met an acquaintance on the train. He'd experienced it all in Hamburg as an anti-aircraft soldier. It smelled so strongly of corpses that you couldn't get the stench out of your nose. Leaflets were dropped over Hamburg with quotes from the war speeches of Hitler and Goering, without any comments. Erich Kästner, writer, War Diary.
Hamburg, July the 30th, 1943. My Hannele, words can't express what we are going through here. A government that cannot protect its women and children is simply criminal. My Hannele, if I could only hear one word from you and Georg, your mother. Magdalena Zimmermann.
When he traveled to Bavaria to the Berghof, or the Führer headquarters, then he went by train and at night with blacked-out windows, so that he wasn't faced with the devastation from the bombing raids. Bernd Freitag von Loinghofen, Captain.
During the entire war, Adolf Hitler never once visited a bombed city. Albert Speer.
The toll on those who flew was horrific. 2 out of every 3 boys who flew missions were killed. And by boy, I'm talking about an average age of 20. The 8th Air Force had more casualties in World War II than the Marine Corps and the Navy combined. Robert Morgan.
Baldur von Schirach came on June the 24th, Corpus Christi. He had a long and detailed conversation with Hitler, the contents of which I learned from Hitler the next evening. Schirach said unequivocally to Hitler that the war must be stopped somehow. Hitler said to him,
"What is he thinking? He knows as well as I that there's no way out now, unless I put a bullet through my head."
That was their last meeting. Niklaus von Below, Colonel, Luftwaffe Adjutant to Adolf Hitler.
On September the 8th, 1943, Adolf Hitler attends the briefing at Army Group South headquarters in Zaporozhye in the Ukraine to discuss the alarming situation in the Donbass region with its commander, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein. In July, with German armored divisions suffering major losses, the offensive against the protruding Soviet front at Kursk fails. In March, under Manstein's command, the Wehrmacht has been able to stabilize the Eastern Front after Stalingrad, with a hard-fought victory in the so-called Third Battle of Kharkov, but subsequently had to vacate the city in August 1943. The retreat begins almost everywhere on the Eastern Front.
September the 8th, 1943. It is a race of hope with the war, a race of death with death. What will come first? The death of fascism or my death? Is that only my question? Oh no. Tens of thousands of prisoners are asking the same thing, and millions of soldiers and dozens of millions of people in all of Europe and the entire world are asking the same. Julius Fučík, Czech journalist and writer, imprisoned by the Gestapo, executed 1943.
Mass execution at Berlin Plötzensee prison, September the 7th to 12th, 1943. 186 died on the first night. The men went to the gallows without shirts, their jackets thrown loosely over their shoulders, hands tied behind their backs, clattering wooden clogs on their feet. Victor von Kostomsky, German prisoner in Plötzensee prison. Memoirs.
Diary, Friday, September the 10th, 1943. Special announcement. We have occupied Italy, encountered only little opposition. The army is being disarmed. Henrietta Schneider.
Dr. Theo Morell, Adolf Hitler's personal physician. Diary, September the 23rd, 1943. 8:15 p.m. Examination after dinner. Strong flatulence, spasms from agitation. Stomach shows increased fat formation. Prescribed a diet.
He admired Morell and his art and was, in a sense, dependent on him and his medication. Albert Speer.
New Year's Proclamation, 1944. The year 1944 will make hard and heavy demands on all Germans. The monstrous events of the war will come closer to crisis this year. We are fully confident that we will endure. Adolf Hitler.
Die Feuerzangenbowle, the Punch Bowl, premiered in 2 Berlin cinemas simultaneously. The previous night, 1,077 English planes had dropped 3,715 tons of bombs on Berlin. Heinz Rühmann, actor and director.
Diary, Monday, February the 7th, 1944. In the East, the terrible war rages on. Henrietta Schneider.
Edgar Kupfer-Kobowitz, prisoner in concentration camp Dachau, April the 20th, 1944. Today is Hitler's birthday. It struck me that of 10 houses, only maybe 8 of them had flags flying, so people are growing weary. But it was still more amazing to see that even in the SS housing estate, only a few flags were flying.
Diary, May the 9th, 1944. Patient A. Tension headache left side. Legs trembling due to agitation. Invasion imminent, but where? Dr. Theo Morel.
Diary, May the 27th, 1944. An impression of an increasingly destroyed Berlin. Devastating. At the same time, Berliners are sitting in the sunshine on chairs amid the rubble and debris on the esplanade, as if it were peacetime. Ulrich von Hassel, diplomat and member of the resistance.
The helpful Mr. T firmly believes that Germany will be on its knees by September. And until then, there's nothing to fear, because there are no wagons to deport the Jews in. Besides, he dares to predict that in 1 or 2 weeks, the Wehrmacht will turn its arms on the SS. Ernő Shep, Budapest, Hungarian Jewish writer.
On June 3, 1944, Eva Braun's sister Gretel married SS Section Commander Hermann Fegelein. They celebrated on the Obersalzberg. Fegelein had been a liaison officer in the Waffen-SS since the beginning of the year. He had fought, as one heard, extremely well at the front. Above all, however, Fegelein was a smoothie whom women fell for in droves. Eva set him up with her younger sister Gretel. Rohush Misch, member of Hitler's military escort.
Several hours after the marriage of Hitler and Eva Braun, on April the 29th, 1945, a ceremony that makes Hermann Fegelein Hitler's brother-in-law, Hitler has him court-martialed for desertion and shot.
The plutocratic world of the West can undertake its threatened landing attempt whenever it wants. It will fail. Adolf Hitler, Order of the Day to the Wehrmacht.
They told us their astonishing declaration, which was that by the following morning, a period of relatively good weather, heretofore completely unexpected, would ensue, lasting probably 36 hours. I quickly announced the decision to go ahead with the attack on June the 6th. Dwight D. Eisenhower, U.S. General, Supreme Allied Commander, Europe.
Hitler was told of the landing on the morning of June the 6th. He expressed relief when he received the first report and said now it would be possible to beat the enemy. Nikolaus von Below.
The conviction of the Germans that we would not attack in the weather then prevailing was a definite factor in the degree of surprise we achieved. In the Omaha sector, an alert enemy division, the 352nd, which prisoners stated had been in the area on maneuvers and defense exercises, accounted for some of the intensive fighting in that locality. Dwight D. Eisenhower.
When I heard the radio report of the Allied invasion in Normandy on June the 6th, 1944, it brought tears to my eyes. I have not cried often. Willy Brandt, German-Norwegian refugee in exile in Sweden.
Actually, things are happening now. The invasion of Normandy began in the night of the 5th to the 6th of June. Rome surrendered long ago, and in Russia, the Russians are almost at the border. It's just terrible, but everyone believes so firmly in victory. It doesn't bear thinking about if we were to lose. Gudrun Himmler, daughter of Heinrich Himmler.
Until the end, he had a firm grip on everything, despite his poor health. What waves of faint-heartedness would have spread if he had lost his composure just once? Albert Speer.
It wasn't so pointless, fighting on like some defeatists claimed at the time, when at the end of June 1944 the Soviet offensive began from the central section of the front. In 14 days, a powerful storm tide swept over the German front lines, burying everything in its path and surging 800 kilometers forwards. Leon de Grelle, Belgium, commander of the Wallonian Waffen-SS.
By mid-July, Army Group Center had lost 28 divisions and 350,000 men. That was an even worse defeat than Stalingrad, even if it wasn't reported much in public because it occurred in summer and wasn't accompanied by the same tragic conditions as Stalingrad, cold and hunger. Bernd Freitag von Loinghofen.
The Führer then referred to assassination attempts against him and recounted by what good fortune he had escaped certain death. That he had not fallen victim to the bomb attack in the Burgerbräu Keller on November the 9th, 1939, was only due to the fact that at the last minute his aircraft could not take off due to bad weather, and he thus had to leave earlier on his special train. Werner Körpen, Adjutant to Reich Minister Alfred Rosenberg. Minutes of recollected table talk at the Wolfschanze Führer headquarters.
On July the 20th, 1944, I'd received the order to prepare for the move of the operations unit from Mauerwald to Zossen, south of Berlin. It was a hot East Prussian summer's day. Mauerwald was located just 20 kilometers away from the Wolfschanze, where Stauffenberg's bomb exploded around 12:45 p.m. Bernd Freitag von Loinghofen.
I remember thunder combined with a brightly flashing flame. At the same time, thick smoke. After a few seconds of complete silence, I heard someone call. It was probably Field Marshal Keitel.
Where is the Führer?
Heinz Buchholz, stenographer in the Wolfschanze headquarters.
There were agitated calls for a doctor. A bomb exploded, nothing happened to the boss, but the hut was blown sky high. Christa Schröder.
Heinz Linger, valet to Adolf Hitler. When I arrived, I saw Hitler, who looked at me inquiringly with big eyes and stared at my troubled face. With a calm smile, he said,
Linger, someone tried to kill me.
I heard about the attack from Professor Morell on the platform in Görlitz. His pulse was completely calm and as normal as any day. The doctor was about to tell me further details when Hitler appeared. On the outside, you couldn't see anything. When the train with Mussolini arrived, I saw Hitler extend his left hand to his guest. Paul Otto Schmidt, interpreter for Adolf Hitler.
Doctor, I hear that you're taking care of my friends. I didn't really want to bother you, but over the past 2 days, since the explosion, I have had a sharp pain in my right ear and difficulty hearing. My valet says it's because I shout too much. Adolf Hitler to Dr. Erwin Giesing, Hitler's private ear, nose and throat doctor.
Diary, Friday, July the 21st, 1944. The radio broadcast details of the attack. The bomb was planted by a Count von Stauffenberg. Around 1 o'clock, the Führer spoke to prove that he had survived. What would have happened if the Führer had died? The war would be over, and there would be revolution in Germany. Henrietta Schneider.
His confidence, his faith in victory and his assurance, but also his power consciousness and delusions of grandeur now exceeded all boundaries of reason. Traudl Junge.
When Herr Hitler escaped his bomb on July the 20th, he described his survival as providential. I think that from a purely military point of view, we can all agree with him, for certainly it would be most unfortunate if the Allies were to be deprived, in the closing phases of the struggle, of that form of warlike genius by which Corporal Hitler has so notably contributed to our victory. Winston Churchill, address to the House of Commons.
Diary, July the 23rd, 1944. The criminal court that now has to be convened must be of historic proportions. Those with an ambiguous attitude have also earned the death penalty. Joseph Goebbels.
Diary, July the 25th, 1944. The enemy is already in Paris. Henrietta Schneider, refugee, lodging in Lesnica, East Prussia.
In the month of August 1944, the defeat of Germany was within reach. Nothing would be able to prevent it any longer. But it would not be our victory like in the year 1918, the victory of France at the height of its power, that marched at the front of the Allied nations. Paul Stalin, Major of the Free French Forces.
We heard about German defeats at the front, and that Germans were giving up their homes and heading off back to the Reich with their worldly possessions. This filled us with satisfaction and was a joy for our oppressed spirits. Paja Wapner Levine, Jew from Vilnius, Stutthof concentration camp, West Prussia.
In September 1944, the generals at the front and the district party leaders in the Western region expected the armies of the Americans and British to take advantage of their power and overrun our nearly unarmed and battle-weary troops in an unceasing offensive. In this last phase of the war, within 6 months, a total of 12,720 fighter planes were delivered to the troops, who had begun the war in 1939 with only 771 fighter aircraft. Albert Speer, Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production.
September 1944, German-Luxembourg border. I peered at the town through powerful binoculars. To the naked eye, the Siegfried Line was just a landscape. There was a village on the horizon that was supposed to be sheltering 2 divisions of Huns. Lee Miller, US war photographer.
Ernest Hemingway, writer and war correspondent. Letter to Mary Welch, Hemres, Germany, September the 13th, 1944. Yesterday we came into the new Indian country after a fine wild day of hunting and shooting and settled down in a deserted farmhouse for the night. It was a fine day following tank tracks through the woods. Have had the place all cleaned up. I wish the people would come back and take care for the dog. They only had 2 books. One on wild beasts of Germany, a nice book, and one on the Olympic Games in Berlin in 1936. Have read them both.
Personal War Diary, October the 7th, 1944. Morning briefing. Beginning of the attack on East Prussia and Budapest. Long discussion with Goering. Station 12 heavy anti-aircraft batteries immediately to protect the Führer's headquarters. Werner Kreipe, General of the Aviators, Chief of Staff, Luftwaffe.
Königsberg, October the 18th, 1944. Speech on radio. Every block of flats in every town, every village, every farm, every forest is being defended by men, boys, and old men, and, when necessary, by women and girls. It is better to have the younger generation die and save the people than to protect the young ones and let an entire nation of 80 to 90 million people die out. Heinrich Himmler.
Personal War Diary, October the 22nd, 1944. Fog, situation in East Prussia unchanged. Keitel for relocating to Berlin, Hitler against it. Werner Kreiper.
October the 24th, 1944. Penultimate radio message from the 246th Volksgrenadier Division. The last defenders of Aachen remember their beloved German homeland. We are firmly confident of our final victory and donate to the Winter Relief Fund 10,458 Reichsmarks. We will fight on.
October the 24th, 1944. Last radio message. After a bitter struggle from house to house, man to man, the battle group Aachen has fired its last ammunition and used up its water and food supplies. The remainder of the defenders of the German Kaiserstadt are in close combat around the command post. Beforehand, a final farewell in unshakable belief in the victory of our beloved German homeland. Long live the Führer. Gerhard Wilk, Colonel, Combat Commander of Aachen.
Diary, Friday, October the 20th, 1944. The Russians are in Eidkau. Around 5 o'clock, there was a report on the radio about heavy fighting between Rominter Heath and Ebenrode. One still has hope. Henrietta Schneider.
We were still stuck in East Prussia. It couldn't be much longer before the Russians drove us out. On clear autumn days, we could hear the thunder of guns. Traudeljunge.
On October the 12th, 1944, when the military situation in the West had consolidated again and there was new talk about a front, Hitler took me aside and explained that he would pull all available forces together and launch a major offensive in the West.
That will be the big strike which must succeed.
Albert Speer, Memoirs.
Diary, Sunday, October the 28th, 1944. We listened to Goebbels last night. He spoke openly about the situation, which is not hopeless. Our room is warm. Henrietta Schneider.
In the first days of November 1944, we moved out of the Wolfschanze because the Russians were close by. Traudeljunge.
In the autumn of 1944, Freudenstadt in the Black Forest is to all intents and purposes still an idyll. In this amateur film, the absence of men under 45 reveals that here too they have all been drafted. Less than 100 kilometers away, beyond the ridges of the Black Forest and the Rhine, American and Free French troops advance. Soviet forces have reached northeastern East Prussia, and the Americans have been at Aachen, on the Saar and the Sauer, on the territory of the old German Reich since September. During the conquest of Freudenstadt by the First French Army on April the 15th and 16th, 1945, 95% of the little town will be destroyed.
Germany was under intense pressure. At the end of 1944, weapons production fell sharply. Trapped in the east, southeast, south, and west, Germany was strategically encircled and could not break free. Nevertheless, Hitler took one ultimate measure after the other. The Nazis suppressed without mercy the slightest opposition to their regime. It was clear to us that Germany was mobilizing its last forces. But at the end of 1944, Germany was still able to defend itself and put up serious resistance. Its military still consisted of around 17.5 million men, of whom 5.3 million were fighting troops. Georgy Zhukov, Commander-in-Chief, 1st White Russian Front.
At just 19 years old, Walter was also killed in action. I was sitting on the roof of our house that had been damaged in another bombing when I saw the postman bring the death notice. My aunt called through the house, "Walter has fallen." The death of my brother was a deep shock for me. Helmut Kohl, schoolboy.
Hitler stayed at his Berghof for the last time before the assassination attempt. He will not see his residence in the mountains again. On November the 20th, 1944, he left the Wolfschanze forever and travelled to Berlin. On December the 11th, he travels to the Adlerhorst Führer headquarters in Hesse.
Speech to division commanders, December the 12th, 1944, in Adlerhorst, near Ziegenberg, Hesse. If we suffer a few more really hard strikes, then this artificially maintained common front can suddenly collapse at any moment in a huge clap of thunder. Adolf Hitler.
Hitler revealed the following to a very limited circle of listeners. Due to a noticeable weakness of enemy forces in the Eifel region, he had decided to start the attack from there. The target had to be Antwerp. Siegfried Westphal, Major General, Chief of Staff to the Commander-in-Chief West.
In a desperate situation, perhaps only a desperate decision can help. Alfred Jodl, Chief of the Operations Staff of the Armed Forces I command.
On December the 16th, 1944, General Bradley came to my headquarters to discuss ways and means of overcoming our acute shortages in infantry replacements. Just as he entered my office, a staff officer came in to report slight penetrations of our line. It was through this same region that the Germans launched their great attack of 1940. Dwight D. Eisenhower.
German tanks have been spotted north of the city of Luxembourg. Rundstedt has ordered the tanks to advance through the Ardennes in nearly the same place as the Germans penetrated in May 1940. They're heading in the same direction again, to the Channel coastline towards Antwerp, in order to stop the Allies using the port through which their main supplies come. Stefan Heim, Corporal of the US Army, writer.
It was my opinion that it was necessary to play Hitler's last card to maximum effect. As a Gurkha, I tried to get as close as possible to the front. The troops pushing forward were in a good mood because low-hanging clouds prevented any aerial activity. I was worried that the weather would brighten up. Albert Speer, Memoirs.
As long as the weather kept our planes on the ground, it would be an ally of the enemy worth many additional days. Dwight D. Eisenhower.
A report of the Supreme Command of the Wehrmacht, December the 18th, 1944. At 5:30 a.m. on December the 16th, German forces started to attack in strength along a broad front from the Siegfried Line and overran in the first advance the front-line positions between Hohenfels and the northern part of Luxembourg.
The German attack quickly gained the popular name Battle of the Bulge because of the rapid initial progress made by the heavy assault against our weakly held line, with the resulting penetration into our front that reached a maximum depth of some 50 miles. Dwight D. Eisenhower.
December the 19th, 1944. The weather was so bad that I directed all army chaplains to pray for dry weather. I also published a prayer and sent it to all members of the command. George S. Patton, Jr., Commander of the 3rd U.S. Army. Almighty and most merciful Father, we humbly beseech Thee, of Thy great goodness, to restrain these immoderate rains with which we have had to contend. Grant us fair weather for battle. Graciously hearken to us, as soldiers who call upon thee, that armed with thy power we may advance from victory to victory, and crush the oppression and wickedness of our enemies, and establish thy justice among men and nations. Amen.
The offensive undertaken between Echternach and Malmedy, consisting of 24 divisions, including 10 tank divisions, almost reached the Maas River around December the 25th. There's a danger that the Germans will overrun the front in Holland from the back, via Namur and Liège. Charles de Gaulle, Memoirs.
Our last major offensive in the West, with 300,000 men that was so gloriously successful at the start, failed in the end thanks to 10 days of radiant sunshine. The Anglo-Americans were thus able to deploy their overwhelming air superiority. Léon de Grelle, commander of the Wallonian Waffen-SS.
The Allies had expected to reach the River Rhine by Christmas at the latest. The Ardennes offensive prevented that. But how many men lost their lives due to this senseless delay? Walter Roland, industrialist, commissioner for tank production in Ministry of Armaments and War Production.
Rudolf Jordan, Provincial NSDAP Leader, Defense Commissioner, December the 25th, 1944. When we were sitting together one sunny morning, tears appeared in my wife's eyes. Where will we be at Christmas next year? This was the question asked by the mother of our children, the question of the family's fate. This question would be asked in the house of the provincial leader and everywhere else in Germany. I was frightened, because I felt that the answer was no longer convincing. But I had to remain the same person, Hitler's deputy, the spokesman of German hope until the end. I know today that it was the belief in a miracle.
In the days after Christmas, it was clear that the expected success would not be achieved. At the end of the year, the offensive had to be seen as a failure. Nicholas von Below.
Adolf Hitler, at the end of December 1944, to his adjutant Nicholas von Below. I know the war is lost. Their superiority is too great. I will prefer to put a bullet in my head now. We will never capitulate, never. We can perish, but we'll take the world with us.
Even after the Allied landing in Normandy and one final failed attempt to fight back in the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler will not accept that there is no way out. Even large parts of the German population still believe in the Führer and are waiting for the miraculous promised turning point. Hitler finally retreats to the bunker under the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, a city day and night under Allied bombardment. When the Russians have more or less surrounded Berlin, in a briefing on April the 22nd, Adolf Hitler declares the war lost. 1 week later, he marries his longtime secret partner, Eva Braun. Not until April the 30th, when the Russians are 500 meters from the bunker, can Hitler accept the finality of his defeat. Now he has to take a decision and act on it.
December the 31st, 1944, Luxembourg. You sat there with a half-empty glass in your hand.
and listened to the hoarse voice with the unmistakable accent. 2 or 3 times the speaker almost lost his voice, and he also got his words mixed up. But that was always the case when he got excited. It was significant that his throaty bellow no longer wanted to work that New Year's Eve. Stefan Heim, Corporal of the US Army, writer.
For Hitler, extending hostilities meant multiplying the losses, the destruction, the suffering of the German people, just to enable his hopeless pride to live on a few weeks longer. Undoubtedly, having failed, Hitler wanted his work to perish in an apocalypse. Charles de Gaulle, Memoirs.
Diary, Sunday, January the 13th, 1945. Frau Gersner said today that the Russians were coming. But Herr Lenhardt says that they will never make it to Berlin. The Führer will see to that. Traudel B., housewife, NSDAP member, Berlin.
Diary, Wednesday, January the 24th, 1945. The news from East Prussia continues to be really bad. The enemy is at Elbing and pushing towards Morungen, Insterburg, occupied after heavy fighting. Thorn, Posen, Bromberg, Silesia in flight. Oppeln occupied, fighting in Breslau. Henrietta Schneider, Witze, District Celle, Lower Saxony.
The remainder of the German army, indeed entire armies, disappeared. They were engulfed by the masses of tanks storming forward. Bernd Freitag von Loinghofen, Army Adjutant to Adolf Hitler.
I asked the Führer, "Do you believe then, my Führer, that we can still win the war at all?" Hitler answered,
"We must."
Christa Schröder, Hitler's private secretary.
Diary, January the 26th, 1945. Now we're advancing. We have to march 50 kilometers. Today we'll reach Germany. Vladimir Gelfand, 2nd Lieutenant, 1050th Rifle Regiment of the Red Army.
Adolf Hitler, last radio address to the German people, January the 30th, 1945. Thus I now appeal to the entire German people to gird themselves with a yet greater, stronger spirit of resistance until we can again, as before, put on the graves of the dead of this titanic struggle a wreath inscribed with the words, "And yet you were victorious." I therefore expect every German to fulfill his duty to the utmost, to make every sacrifice that will and must be required.
Diary, Tuesday, January the 30th, 1945. Big day. Our Führer has spoken. The Russians are coming. But we will be victorious again and beat back the Bolsheviks. Traudel B., Berlin.
In mid-February 1945, we finally returned to Berlin from the Western Front. The close circle around Hitler had taken up its position again. Rochus Misch, Sergeant of Leibstandarte SS, telephone operator in the Führer's bunker.
February the 13th, 1945. The model of Linz is finally finished. The extensive model of the development of the Danube riverbanks was now set up in one of the large, brightly toned basements of the new chancellery. When I led Adolf Hitler into this room, he stood for a long time, just looking, as though overwhelmed by the general impression. I moved the spotlight to the position of the sun's rays in the afternoon. Now he was presented with the perspective of how his city on the Danube would look in his retirement. Hermann Giesler, General Building Inspector for the redevelopment of the city of Linz.
During the last 4.5 months of the war, 471,000 tons of bombs are dropped on Germany, twice as much as in the whole of 1943. In March 1945 alone, 3 times as many bombs fall as in all of 1942.
Today, the terrible news came that Dresden has been almost completely destroyed by the Anglo-Americans. Herr Hermann says that we have a new rocket that flies even as far as to the Anglo-Americans. I certainly hope so. Trout it'll be. Berlin.
Not a day went by when the government quarters were not attacked. When a bomb exploded nearby, the bunker lying in the groundwater swayed noticeably. The light began to flicker, so Hitler raised his voice as if in a dream.
That was close. Those bombs could have hit us.
He was noticeably fearful and didn't feel safe. Christa Schröder.
Diary, March the 13th, 1945. Although the bridgehead is not large, 2.5 to 3 kilometers, it is difficult to drive the enemy out of there since they're dug in on massive, steep fortified hills. Marines are positioned across from us, the battalion with a strength of 400 men. Serious opposition. Vladimir Gelfand, 1050th Rifle Regiment.
It is not necessary to consider the basic things that people need for a primitive further existence. What remained after the battle would in any event be inferior, since all the good ones would have fallen. Adolf Hitler's answer to a note from Albert Speer, quoted by Heinz Guderian, March 1945.
Jokes were still being made. Someone said that Berlin was really practical as a headquarters. You could get the local train from the Eastern Front to the Western Front. Hitler could still laugh about it. Gertraud Traudl-Junge, Hitler's private secretary.
In mid-March 1945, Hitler transfers nearly all of his activities to the bunker under the Chancellery. Since then, he rarely sees daylight.
Sometime in mid-March, Eva Braun arrived at the Reichschancellery. Hitler tried his best to get her to go back to Munich, but she made it clear that her place was at Hitler's side, and no one would be able to change her mind. Rochus Misch.
Hitler had always emphasized with resignation that there was only one person who would remain faithful to him in his final hour, and that was Eva Braun. Here, his instinct did not let him down. Albert Speer.
April the 20th, 1945 was always referred to as the date of the last photos and film segments of Hitler and the delegation of the Hitler Youth. This is not true. They are in fact from a different reception of a delegation by Hitler. This took place on March the 20th, 1945. Arthur Axmann, leader of the Hitler Youth.
That was no longer our Hitler as we knew him, but a man marked by fate, an almost broken man, decaying to death. Rudolf Jordan, District NSDAP leader.
Diary, March the 23rd, 1945, midnight. The Führer said that he could see very little with his right eye. His left hand is slightly swollen, due to tremors. Also, his left ankle and left lower leg show swelling in places. The Führer does not want to wear an eye patch. Dr. Theo Morell, Hitler's personal physician.
Beyond the Siegfried Line, our forces consolidate, and the drive becomes like a great river pushing against a series of decomposing dams. One dam breaks, and the torrent lashes onward until it hits another obstruction. Even the most fanatical Nazis must now see that the game is up. Audie Murphy, Lieutenant, most highly decorated U.S. soldier of World War II.
Diary, March the 17th, 1945. The German army is on the run. The best army in the world is pouring back. Where to? The River Weser? Oh God, you fools. You could not defend the Atlantic or the Siegfried Line or the Rhine. What do you think you can do inside Germany? Friedrich Kellner, court employee, Laubach, Hessia.
Diary, March the 28th, 1945. It really is admirable how the Führer, with this dilemma on the front, still persistently believes in his luck. You sometimes have the impression that he lives in the clouds. Joseph Goebbels.
One man climbs out, badly wounded. The cameraman is nearly knocked off his feet by the blast, but he keeps his camera focused as best he can as the hectic fury of the street fighting sweeps around him.
The villages here along the Rhine are in pretty good shape. In the middle, of course, is Cologne, and Cologne is one of the great ruins of the world. The Germans are nice and fat too, and quite clean and orderly and industrious. They carry on their normal lives. Martha Gellhorn, US Army War Correspondent.
Diary, Good Friday, March the 30th, 1945. The report from the army was terrifying. Tank spearheads by Kassel, Fulda occupied, Danzig, Gedingen, Gotenhafen surrendering. What is happening? Henrietta Schneider.
Diary, April 3rd, 1945, Narvik. Holy Week and Easter bring the encirclement of the Ruhr Valley. Turkey, Egypt, Syria, Argentina, Chile, Venezuela, Peru and Ecuador declare war on us, which means the mobilization of all neutral remaining powers outside of Europe on the side of the Western Allies. Westphalia, Hessia, Thuringia, Franconia, Baden, Württemberg are battlefields. Hungary is lost. Udo from Alvensleben, Captain, Diary.
The Greater German Reich finds itself in a state of war with 52 states, among them the former Axis powers Italy, Romania, Bulgaria and Finland.
During the few weeks of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's fourth administration, I saw what the long years had done to him. It was no wonder that the years had left their mark. Harry S. Truman, Vice President of the United States of America.
Winston, in fairly good form, said that if he were Hitler, he would have himself flown over to this country, hand himself to the government, stating that he alone was responsible for all the evils of Germany, and was prepared to stand the racket. According to Winston, this would face us with a difficult problem. Alan Brooke, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, British Forces.
Shortly before 5 o'clock in the afternoon of Thursday, April the 12th, 1945, after the Senate adjourned, I went to the office of Sam Rayburn at the House of Speakers. As I entered, the Speaker told me that the President's press secretary had just telephoned, requesting me to call the White House. I returned the call. "Please come right away," he told me in a strained voice. I reached the White House about 5:25 p.m. and was immediately taken in the elevator to the second floor and ushered into Mrs. Roosevelt's study. Mrs. Roosevelt seemed calm in her characteristic graceful dignity. She placed her arm gently about my shoulder. "Harry," she said quietly, "the president is dead." I had been afraid for many weeks that something might happen to this great leader. And now that the worst happened, I was unprepared for it. Harry S. Truman.
Bridgehead behind the Oder River, west of Kostschön. Roosevelt is dead. I bow my head in deep sorrow for this loss. Vladimir Gelfand.
April the 12th, 1945. There are cities in Germany that make Coventry and Plymouth appear to be the damage done by a petulant child. Edward Murrow, radio correspondent for CBS News.
Diary, Thursday, April the 12th, 1945. Herr Hermann says it would be better if the Americans came. Now I'm really frightened. Gaudel B., Berlin.
It was between 3 and 4 a.m. on April the 11th, 1945. Suddenly cries were heard. They grew louder and louder. We stumbled outside to discover the cause. "Look, the gate!" somebody shouted. The crooked swastika had disappeared. Something white fluttered on the flagpole. The delightfully victorious minute for which our German comrades had waited for 4,453 days and nights was finally there. In the evening, an American infantry unit arrived. Thomas Geffer, German Jew, prisoner in Buchenwald.
It will not be pleasant listening. I propose to tell you of Buchenwald. We reached the main gate. The prisoners crowded up behind the wire. There surged around me an evil-smelling stink. Men and boys reached out to touch me. They were in rags and the remnants of uniforms. Death had already marked many of them, but they were smiling with their eyes. Edward Murrow.
Diary, Kungsgatan, Stockholm. A hot scent of blood is blowing from Germany and a terrible feeling of gloom spreading. It feels like the decline of the Western world. Germans have the opportunity to see the horrors. Astrid Lindgren, writer and member of the Swedish Secret Service. Diary.
For a long time, I have been telling myself what's happening in the world now cannot be true, and that I am just imagining it, that I am hallucinating, and at some point I will surely wake up. Erno Schepp, Hungarian Jewish writer from Budapest.
We proceeded to the small courtyard. The wall adjoined what had been a stable or garage. We entered. It was floored with concrete. There were 2 rows of bodies stacked up like cordwood. Edward Murrow.
We are not entirely guiltless, we the Allies, because it took us 12 years to open the gates of Dachau. We were blind and unbelieving and slow, and that we can never be again. We must know now that there can never be peace if there is cruelty like this in the world. Martha Gellhorn.
If Hitler falls into our hands, we shall certainly put him to death. This man is the mainspring of evil. Winston Churchill, Diary of Cabinet Secretary Sir Norman Brooke, July the 6th, 1942.
Diary, Sunday, April the 15th, 1945. My God, the war seems to be lost. Why doesn't the Führer give up? Goudelby, Berlin.
Letter to Marga and Gudrun Himmler, April the 17th, 1945. My dear beloved mummy, my dear little daughter. Times are extremely difficult for all of us, and yet it will all still turn out well. That is my firm belief. But it is difficult. The ancient spirit will protect us, and the good German nation especially, and not allow us to perish. Heil Hitler. Love, Daddy. Heinrich Himmler. Last letter to his family.
On April the 21st, I went directly to the map room for my daily briefing on the war situation. German resistance was collapsing on all fronts. There could be no doubt that the end of the war in Europe was in sight. Harry S. Truman, U.S. President, Memoirs.
On April the 21st, our troops reached the Berlin Autobahn Ring. This success created favorable conditions to totally enclose the fascist capital. Vasily Chuikov, General commanding Soviet 8th Guards Army.
That day, I saw Hitler only briefly. The boss could still not believe that the Russians were at the gates. Rochus Misch.
Sechlin, Mecklenburg. Around 11:50 p.m., Hitler calls. He gives a short lecture on the situation and concludes with the words,
"You will see. The Russians will suffer the biggest defeat, the bloodiest defeat in their history before the gates of Berlin."
Karl Koller, Chief of the General Staff of the Luftwaffe.
Karlsdorf near Berlin, April the 22nd, 1945. Someone said, "It's over. The Russians are here. We should come out." Everyone climbed out of the trench with their hands up. I put my hands up only a little, because I thought I did not have to surrender. Formerly, I was on the side of the losers, but my emotions were on the side of the winners. Marie Yalovich Simon, a German Jew hiding in Berlin.
April the 22nd, 1945. This date marks the end of the Third Reich for me. The German Wehrmacht capitulated on May the 8th, 1945. But on April the 22nd, a Sunday, Hitler capitulated. Rochus Misch.
On April the 22nd, we attended the status report at the usual time in the afternoon. I recognized immediately that clouds as heavy as lead were hanging over the room. Wilhelm Keitel, Chief of the Armed Forces High Command, Memoirs.
I have already reached my decision. I won't leave Berlin again. I will defend the city till the end. Either I lead the fighting around the capital of the Reich, or I perish with my soldiers in Berlin and die in the battle for the symbol of the Reich. Adolf Hitler.
During the status conference, which had been loud and turbulent, Hitler had finally uttered the magical sentence, and since then repeated it to everybody who crept around the bunker disbelievingly.
The war is lost.
Rochus Misch.
Traudel Junge. In the small anteroom, Hitler stands motionless. In a distant and commanding manner, he calls out,
"Get changed at once. In 1 hour, an aircraft will come and take you to the south. Everything is lost, hopelessly lost."
Eva Braun walks up to Hitler. takes both of his hands and says smilingly and consolingly,
"But you know that I'm staying here with you. I will not be sent away."
as if talking to a sad child. Hitler's eyes begin to light up, and he does something that no one has ever witnessed, not even his most trusted friends and aides. He kisses Eva Braun on the lips.
On the night of April the 22nd, 23rd, my first night in the Führer's bunker, I was witness to a strange spectacle. The rats abandoned the sinking ship. He let anybody go who asked. Bernd Freitag von Loinghofen.
On the evening of April the 22nd, a Sunday, while the besieging ring closes around Berlin, Eva Braun writes the first of her farewell letters to her childhood friend, Hertha Ostermeier.
Letter, Berlin, April the 22nd, 1945. My dearest Hertha, these will be the very last lines and thus the last sign of life from me. We are fighting to the end, but the end is drawing dangerously ever nearer. I can't describe how much I am suffering personally on the Führer's behalf. What else is there to say? I can't understand how it could all turn out this way, but you can't even believe in God anymore. Regards to all my friends. I shall die as I have lived. It's no burden, you know that. Warm greetings to all, and kisses, yours, Eva.
Diary, April the 23rd, 1945, Monday. Early bombing raids over the town of Ohrfeld to the east. In the afternoon, buried a chest full of food. Radio reports fighting in Ulm, Regensburg. Berlin is encircled. The Führer in Berlin. Werner Heisenberg, German Nobel laureate in physics.
On April the 24th, our troops attacked along the entire front and pushed the enemy further back in the direction of the city center. The Soviet 8th Guards Army joined the 1st Ukrainian Front near Johannisthal Airport the same day. One more step remained. Berlin had to be taken, and the war ended. Vasily Chuikov, General.
Diary, 24th of April 1945, Tuesday, radio, crossing of the Danube River at Dillingen, the Americans at Augsburg. Werner Heisenberg.
Almost coincidentally with our arrival on the Elbe, the Red Army launched a powerful westward drive from the positions on the Oder. The Red Drive made speedy progress everywhere. On April the 25th, patrols of the 69th Division of the V Corps met elements of the Red Army's 58th Guards Division on the Elbe. The meeting took place at Torgau, some 75 miles south of Berlin. Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in Europe.
The fragmentation of Germany into two parts was completed. The German army dissolved before our eyes. Winston Churchill.
Gloom and doom began to spread throughout the bunker. Arthur Axmann.
April the 27th, 1945. Letter to Louise Jodl. We still have radio contact with Berlin, where the enemy has fought its way into the city center. One's heart bleeds during these conversations. It's like the Battle of the Visigoths at Vesuvius. Alfred Jodl, Chief of Armed Forces High Command, Flensburg.
A section of the autobahn between Munich and Augsburg had been converted to an airstrip. In laybys along the road were curious-looking aircraft, sleek and without propellers. One wondered if they had been delivered without them. They were, in fact, the first jet fighters, and a full technological generation more fearsome than anything we or the British possessed. Only a monumental error, Hitler's demand that they be redesigned as a light attack bomber, had kept them from being used with disastrous effect. John Kenneth Galbraith, economist, officer in the Strategic Bombing Command of the US Air Force.
When the sun came out, I worked in the garden with my mother. Berchtesgaden, the mountain retreat where Hitler met with Chamberlain, had been bombed. In London, people prepared to celebrate. Large quantities of liquor were imported but held in reserve for the special day. Flags were everywhere on sale. The Nazis had nowhere left to run. Madeleine Albright, London.
I had close contact with Mohnke, the commander of the citadel. Mohnke was often with the troops on the front line. On April the 29th, he reported to Hitler that to the north, the Russians were a short distance away from Weidendammer Bridge, to the east in Lustgarten, to the south near Potsdamer Platz and the Air Ministry, and to the west in Tiergarten. That was only a few hundred meters from the Chancellery. When Hitler asked him,
"How long can you hold out?"
he answered, 20 to 24 hours at the most. Arthur Axmann.
April the 29th, 1945. Sometime around 11 p.m., a radio dispatch arrived, saying that Italian partisans had shot Mussolini and his mistress Clara Petacci and publicly hanged them by the feet. Had Hitler needed a final push in order to make his own suicide a reality, that was probably it. Rohus Misch.
The Führer comes up to me, shakes my hand and asks,
"Have you rested a little, my child? I'd like to dictate something. Get the shorthand pad."
Traudeljunge.
My private will and testament. As I did not consider that I could take the responsibility of contracting a marriage during the years of fighting, I have now decided, before the closing of my earthly career, to take the girl who, after many years of faithful friendship, entered the practically besieged city of her own free will in order to share her destiny with me as my wife. At her own desire, she goes as my wife with me into death. What I possess belongs, inasmuch as it has any value, to the party. Should this no longer exist, to the state. Should the state also be destroyed, no further decision of mine is necessary. Signed, Berlin, April the 29th, 1945, 4 a.m., Adolf Hitler.
April the 29th, 1945. Hitler only wanted to make Eva Frau Hitler to preserve convention at the end. Above all, for Eva's parents. The Browns wouldn't have to live with the shame of their daughter having died as a concubine. Rohus Misch.
The 30th of April begins like the previous days. The hours crawl by. No one knows how Eva Braun should now be addressed. The aides and orderlies stutter with embarrassment when they have to speak to the young lady.
"Just call me Mrs. Hitler,"
she says with a smile. Gertraud Traudeljunge.
When I left my observation post on April the 30th to go to the army staff, Marshal Georgy Zhukov called and asked, "Is there hope that we will have fully cleaned up Berlin by May Day?" I answered that I did not expect an immediate capitulation, even though the resistance of the enemy had declined. Vasily Chuikov.
On the morning of April the 30th, 1945, Hitler signs his final Führer order.
To the commander of the Berlin defensive area, General of the Artillery, Weitling. In the event of ammunition and food shortages among the defenders of the Reich capital, I give my permission to break out. This should be done in small groups, who should then establish a connection with the troops still fighting. Signed, Adolf Hitler.
April the 30th, 1945 will remain in the memory of the Soviet people. On this day at 2:25 p.m., the troops of the First Shock Army took over most of the Reichstag building. Georgy Zhukov, Supreme Commander of the First White Russian Front.
Around noon on April the 30th, 1945, all occupants of the bunker with military training anticipate an immediate assault on the Chancellery and the bunker.
Lunch on April the 30th also passed without any special occurrences. Hitler showed no signs of agitation. With this in mind, there was no mention of the end now being imminent. Gerda Christian, Hitler's private secretary.
On April the 30th, 1945, around noon, Bormann told me that Hitler's decision was now firm. Then Hitler said to me that he would now shoot himself, and that Fräulein Braun would also take her life. The bodies were to be buried. He assigned me to make the necessary arrangements. Otto Günscher, SS Adjutant to Hitler.
I caught a last glimpse of Hitler as he disappeared into his study. Eva, now his wife, followed him. She looked pretty. For me, she is the only one who went truly nobly to her death. In any case, Eva was alive up until death. She had married a dead man in a mortuary. Rohus Mish.
I went back into the bunker in the afternoon. I visited Dr. Goebbels. He told me that the Führer had already bidden farewell to his closest circle. I went to Hitler's private rooms. SS Adjutant Otto Günscher stood in front of the door, blocking it with his massive figure. He had orders from the Führer not to let any more visitors in. Arthur Axmann.
My political testament. I die with a happy heart in the face of the immeasurable deeds and achievements of our soldiers at the front, our women at home, the achievements of our farmers and workers, and the efforts, unique in history, of our youth who bear my name. In order to give the German people a government composed of honourable men, I appoint the following members of the new cabinet as leaders of the nation. President of the Reich, Dönitz. Chancellor of the Reich, Dr. Goebbels. Above all, I oblige the leaders of the nation and those under them to scrupulously observe the race laws and to offer merciless opposition to the poisoner of all peoples, international jury. Issued in Berlin, this 29th day of April 1945, 4:00 a.m. Adolf Hitler.
Valet Heinz Linger reports the hour of his death as 3:50 p.m. He says he noted this time from a grandfather clock in the anteroom to Hitler's office. Adjutant Otto Günscher cites his final hour as 3:30 p.m. He said he'd looked at his watch.
There cannot be the slightest doubt that Adolf Hitler took his life in the Führer bunker of the Reich Chancellery in Berlin on April the 30th, 1945, with his own hand, namely by a shot in the right temple. Cause of death, District Court 2, Berchtesgaden, December the 8th, 1956.
The Red Army found a dental bridge of Hitler's after a painstaking search for his remains. around the bunker exit.
On April the 30th and May the 1st, 1945, I posted the last radio messages from the Reich Chancellery to Grand Admiral Dönitz via our Naval Signals Brigade. Erich Voss, Vice Admiral.
Telegram in secret Navy encryption. In the place of the current Reichsmarschall Göring, the Führer appoints you, Grand Admiral, as his replacement. You should undertake at once all measures that arise from the present situation. Bormann.
I only learned that Hitler was no longer alive after the first radio dispatch with my appointment was communicated from Berlin on April 30th at 6:15 p.m. Karl Dönitz, Grand Admiral, Commander-in-Chief of the Navy.
Announcement Hamburg Radio, May the 1st, 1945, 10:26 p.m. It is reported from the Führer's headquarters that our Führer, Adolf Hitler, has fallen at his command post in the Reich Chancellery, fighting to his last breath against Bolshevism and for Germany.
May the 1st, 1945. A little later in the evening, my husband came to my bed and said,
Adolf Hitler is dead. He's dead.
There was suddenly an eerie calm. Emmy Göring, actress and wife of Hermann Göring.
On the evening when Hitler's death was announced, I was sleeping in a small room in Dönitz's quarters. When I unpacked my bag, I found the red leather case containing Hitler's portrait. When I stood the photograph up, I was overcome with a fit of weeping. Albert Speer, minister in Dönitz's cabinet, Memoirs.
Interrogation of Mrs. Paula Wolf, Miss Paula Hitler.
My brother's fate affects me very much. No matter what happened, he was still my brother. His end brought indescribable sorrow to me, his sister.
At this point, Miss Hitler burst into tears, and the interrogation was ended. Signed, George Allen, U.S. Army Counterintelligence Corps, July the 12th, 1945.
I was living in Hitler's private apartment in Munich when his death was announced. No Germans, unless they are underground resistance workers or concentration camp inmates, find that Hitler did anything wrong except to lose. I'm just like the soldiers here, who look at the beautiful countryside, use the super modern comforts of their buildings, and wonder why the Germans wanted anything more. Lee Miller, U.S. war photographer.
Before I could declare the event closed on that evening of May the 1st, an agency report was handed to me that prompted me to tell the audience, "Dear friends, Hitler has evaded responsibility by committing suicide. We departed deeply moved." Willy Brandt, Stockholm.
Diary, May the 1st, 1945. History will record forevermore that the German people were not able to shake off this National Socialist yoke by their own initiative. Friedrich Kellner, Laubach.
Diary, Wednesday, May the 2nd, 1945. Adolf Hitler is no more.
Radio reported his heroic death last night, fallen in battle. Dönitz has been appointed as his successor. Mussolini murdered a few days ago. Now the two friends are united in death. Henrietta Schneider.
Hirsch's cell examined Rudolf Hirsch, 46, commandant of the Auschwitz concentration camp. I asked him whether he didn't think he would hang for murder.
No, never.
When did it first occur to you then that you would probably be brought to trial and hanged?
At the time of the collapse, when the Führer died.
Gustav Mark Gilbert, US prison psychologist, Nuremberg Diary.
The White House, Washington, May the 8th, 1945. Dear Mama and Mary, I am 61 this morning, and I slept in the President's room in the White House last night. This will be an historic day. At 9 o'clock this morning, I must make a broadcast to the country announcing the German surrender. Isn't that some birthday present? Lots and love to you both. Harry S. Truman, President of the United States of America, letter to his mother and sister.
It was not disloyalty, but rather his suicide that put an end to Hitler's organization. He and his organization were one and the same, and thus it ended with him. This man who rose out of nothing had offered himself to Germany at a time when it was longing for a new magnet. He formulated a doctrine based on a mixture of fascism and race theory. The totalitarian system allowed him to act without restraint. The mechanization of the military gave him the trump cards of lightning attacks and surprise. All of this led to repression, and that, in turn, led to these crimes. Charles de Gaulle, Memoirs.